It began with boys, not soldiers. Boys barely old enough to shave, barely old enough to understand the world they were about to be consumed by. They wore black uniforms and carried rifles larger than their fears. They marched not because they understood war, but because they had never been allowed to imagine anything else. Their teachers were officers. Their textbooks were propaganda. Their childhood had been rehearsals of obedience. And by 1944, those teenagers became the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, a division built from school desks, youth rallies, and fanatic devotion. They were not trained to think. They were trained to follow. They were not raised to question. They were raised to obey. And within weeks of arriving in Normandy, the world would learn what happens when indoctrination meets combat. Their story began years earlier, long before the beaches of France. Germany's youth were subjected to a relentless campaign, scouts replaced by uniforms, songs replaced by marching chants, imagination replaced by ideology. These children were praised for zeal, rewarded for conformity, shaped to believe that death for their leader was the highest honor. When the war turned against Germany, the regime made a desperate decision: transform these boys into a division of armored soldiers. They combined teenage recruits from the Hitler Youth schools with veterans from the elite Leibstandarte Panzer Division, men hardened by years of brutality and war. These veterans became instructors, drilling the boys without mercy, shaping them into an extension of their own fanaticism. One officer later recalled, "They did not know fear, they did not know doubt, they only knew obedience." When Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Hitlerjugend division was ordered into the fight. The boys rushed into battle with a violent, unbreakable determination that shocked the Canadians and British forces facing them. They did not take cover long enough to survive. They pushed forward even when logic demanded retreat. Many died within minutes. What followed became one of the bloodiest, most savage confrontations of the Normandy campaign. The hedgerows around Caen turned into mazes of death. The air stank of gunpowder and rotting wheat. The screams of the wounded mixed with the thunder of artillery. Some of the young soldiers fought so aggressively that Allied officers believed they were facing veterans until they saw their faces. 17, 18, some younger. And then came the moment that darkened their name forever. During the first weeks of combat, Allied prisoners, mostly Canadian, were captured by units of the Hitlerjugend division. Instead of being processed, many were executed. Some were shot along hedgerows, others near the Abbey d'Ardennes. The brutality was not random. It was ideology in action. Boys told that mercy was treason behaved exactly as they were trained. Historians still debate whether the orders came from above or were an inevitable result of indoctrination. But the graves remain silent proof that children can be molded into weapons. The Hitlerjugend division held Caen with shocking ferocity. But courage cannot stop artillery. Fanaticism cannot defeat air power. Every day, the Allies tightened the noose. Bombers turned positions into firestorms. Tanks crushed bunkers. Soldiers who had once shouted slogans now whispered prayers. The boys who had been molded into soldiers learned the truth of war. Dying for a cause does not make that cause worthy. By August, Normandy collapsed. The Hitlerjugend division retreated through the Falaise Pocket, a slaughterhouse of burning vehicles, wounded horses, and shattered men. Those who survived were forever changed. Their fanaticism began to decay. In its place grew something they had never been allowed to feel before: doubt. But the story didn't end there. 4 months later, the division was thrown into another frozen nightmare, the Battle of the Bulge. Now it was winter. Now fuel was gone. Now rations were gone. Now hope was gone. The same young faces who had stormed into Normandy full of certainty now dug into snow-covered foxholes in the Ardennes, shivering from cold and disbelief. They were told that this offensive would break the Allies, split the front, win back the war. It didn't. Instead, they ran into American roadblocks, artillery barrages, and the grinding reality that the Reich was dying. The boys who were promised glory instead learned the truth. They were not saving a nation. They were being sacrificed by it. By January 1945, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division was shattered. Some surrendered. Some died where they stood. Some simply disappeared into snowy forests. They had followed orders all the way to ruin. Today, the story of the Hitlerjugend Division is not a tale of heroism. It is a warning. It is proof that a regime can steal childhood and forge it into a weapon. It shows how easily belief can become brutality when guided by a system that rewards obedience over humanity. These boys were trained to be soldiers before they ever learned how to be men. Tonight, we return to the hedgerows of Normandy, to the snow of the Ardennes, to the moment when youth was weaponized and innocence was turned into ammunition. This is the entire history of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, from indoctrination to destruction, from devotion to disillusionment, and from blind loyalty to the silence of defeat. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and safe, or can you almost feel the cold wind of the Ardennes brushing against your skin as the past begins to breathe again? And if these deep dives into history help you relax, reflect, or fall asleep while learning something real, consider subscribing. Your support keeps me motivated to continue creating these for you. September 16th, 1943. Berlin's Olympiastadion trembles with the synchronized stomping of 30,000 boots. Boys, none older than 18, most just 16, stand in perfect formation under the autumn sun, their faces upturned toward the reviewing stand, where Heinrich Himmler surveys what he calls the future of the Reich. These are not soldiers. Not yet. They are Hitler Youth, summoned from every corner of Germany for a selection that will transform some of them into something unprecedented in modern warfare. An entire SS Panzer Division composed exclusively of teenagers. The boys compete with desperate intensity, each hoping to be chosen to finally exchange their brown uniforms for the black of the Schutzstaffel. They do not know they are volunteering for their own destruction. The creation of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend represents the culmination of a decade-long experiment in mass indoctrination. Since 1933, the Hitler Youth had enrolled millions of German boys, transforming childhood itself into a military training ground. Every camping trip was a tactical exercise. Every song a warrior's anthem. Every lesson in school a preparation for sacrifice. By 1943, an entire generation had grown to adolescence knowing nothing but Nazi ideology, their personalities shaped by an organization that deliberately blurred the line between youth movement and military formation. When Himmler proposed creating an SS division from these boys, he was not corrupting innocence, he was harvesting a crop planted 10 years earlier. The authorization came on June 24, 1943, signed by Hitler himself. The division would be called Hitlerjugend, a name that revealed its essential nature, not an army unit that happened to be young, but the Hitler Youth itself transformed directly into a combat force. The recruitment criteria were specific and chilling. All volunteers must be born in 1926, making them 17 years old. All must have served in the Hitler Youth for at least 4 years. All must be physically fit, ideologically pure, and willing to die for the Führer. Within 3 months, over 20,000 boys stepped forward. They came from every social class, farmers' sons and factory workers' children, boys from wealthy families, and boys from tenements. What united them was not background, but belief. Their first commander was Fritz Witt, a 36-year-old SS veteran who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. Witt faced an unprecedented challenge, transforming ideologically prepared but militarily inexperienced teenagers into an elite armored division in less than a year. He established training camps in Belgium, away from the increasingly bombed Reich, where boys could learn the mechanics of war without distraction. The training was deliberately brutal, 20-hour days, forced marches until boys collapsed, live-fire exercises where accidents were dismissed as necessary preparation for combat's randomness. Witt believed that fanaticism alone was insufficient. These boys needed tactical competence to transform belief into battlefield effectiveness. December 1943, Beverloo Training Camp, Belgium. Snow falls on boys learning to field strip an MG-42 machine gun with fingers numb from cold. The weapon weighs 26 pounds, fires 1,300 rounds per minute, and jams easily if not maintained perfectly. A 17-year-old named Hans Weber, later killed at Caen, takes 47 minutes to complete the task his instructor can do in 3. Around him, other boys struggle with equipment designed for grown men, Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons that require strength to lift, Kar 98K rifles with recoil that bruises teenage shoulders, radio sets with procedures that demand concentration. These boys have not yet developed. They are children playing with industrial age, killing tools, and the training cadre know it. The division's command structure revealed a crucial compromise between ideology and pragmatism. While the enlisted ranks consisted almost entirely of Hitler Youth graduates boys averaging 17.5 years old, the NCOs and officers were veterans transferred from other SS units. These men averaged 30 years old and brought experience from the Eastern Front, where they had learned warfare's brutal realities. The age gap created immediate tension. Veteran sergeants mocked their teenage charges as Hitler's baby division. The boys responded with the arrogance of true believers, insisting that ideological purity mattered more than experience. This conflict would persist throughout the division's existence. Young fanatics led by older cynics who had seen too much to believe in anything except survival. By spring 1944, the division had reached its authorized strength of 20,540 men. The equipment manifest read like a wish list: 150 Panzer IV tanks, 39 of the fearsome new Panther tanks, assault guns, self-propelled artillery, armored half-tracks, and thousands of vehicles. On paper, the 12th SS was one of the most powerful divisions in the German military. British intelligence, intercepting coded references to Baby Division and HJ, struggled to comprehend what they were detecting. The concept seemed absurd, an entire armored division of teenagers. Surely this was a deception, a code name for something else. The intelligence officers could not imagine that the Nazis would gamble an entire panzer division's worth of irreplaceable equipment on boys too young to vote. The final formation ceremony took place in early June 1944, days before the division would enter combat. 20,000 boys stood in ranks, new SS runes gleaming on their collars, each having sworn a personal oath to Adolf Hitler. Fritz Witt delivered a speech that captured the division's essential paradox. "You are political soldiers," he told them, "warriors of a new age, who fight not for territory or conquest, but for an idea." The boys believed him, absolutely. They had been raised to see themselves as instruments of historical destiny, the pure generation that would redeem Germany's defeat in the previous war. As they sang Die Fahne hoch, the Nazi anthem with voices not yet deepened by adulthood, they could not imagine that within 2 months, 3/4 of them would be dead, wounded, or imprisoned. The division's deployment to Normandy happened under total secrecy. Units moved only at night, following back roads, maintaining radio silence so complete that Allied signals intelligence detected nothing. They positioned themselves 15 kilometers south of Caen, hidden in the Norman Bocage where centuries-old hedgerows concealed entire tank battalions. The boys dug in, camouflaged their vehicles, and waited. Above them, Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed the same fields daily, their cameras recording nothing but Norman farmland. The Ghost Division had achieved complete surprise. On the evening of June 5, 1944, as Allied paratroopers began dropping into Normandy, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend remained invisible, a coiled spring that no one knew existed. But what creates a soldier willing to die without question? The answer lay not in training but in childhood indoctrination so complete it precluded doubt. These boys had joined the Hitler Youth at 10 years old, the minimum age in 1936 or 37. They had spent their entire adolescence in an organization that systematically replaced family, religion, and personal identity with loyalty to the Führer. Summer camps taught them to inform on parents who expressed doubt about the regime. School lessons portrayed warfare as glorious, death in battle as the highest achievement. By 17, they possessed tactical skills but lacked the emotional development to question orders or comprehend moral complexity. They were perfect soldiers in the sense that they would obey any command without hesitation, and catastrophically flawed soldiers in that they could not adapt when doctrine failed. The division's equipment told its own story of German priorities. The Panther tanks they received were among the finest armored vehicles in the world, 60-ton monsters with sloped armor that could deflect almost any Allied shell, and a 75mm gun capable of destroying enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. But Panthers were mechanically complex, requiring constant maintenance and consuming fuel at rates the German war economy could barely sustain. Giving them to teenage crews was a calculated risk. These boys had been trained obsessively on the vehicles, but lacked the judgment to preserve them. A veteran panzer commander knows when to withdraw a damaged tank for repair. A 17-year-old knows only that retreat is forbidden, that every meter of ground must be held regardless of cost. The Germans were about to discover that fanaticism, while tactically useful, becomes strategically catastrophic when it prevents pragmatic decision-making. Training records from Beverloo reveal disturbing patterns. Accident rates during exercises exceeded those of regular Wehrmacht units by 40%. Boys injured themselves learning to throw grenades, shot themselves cleaning weapons, broke bones during close combat training. The training cadre reported these incidents without apparent concern. Losses before combat were acceptable preparation for losses during combat. More revealing were psychiatric evaluations, rare documents that survived the war. Medical officers noted that recruits displayed unusual susceptibility to group dynamics and difficulty with independent moral reasoning. In civilian terms, these boys were extremely vulnerable to peer pressure and struggled to make ethical decisions without authority figures telling them what to do. In military terms, they were ideal for an organization that demanded unquestioning obedience. The officer corps understood what they commanded, a weapon of tremendous tactical potential and zero strategic flexibility. Kurt Meyer, who would later command the division, wrote in his diary that the boys possessed the courage of lions and the judgment of children. This was not criticism but observation. In defensive operations requiring pure fighting spirit, he believed they would excel. In complex situations requiring initiative or moral reasoning, they would likely fail catastrophically. Meyer's concerns were shared by other officers but dismissed by Himmler, who insisted that ideological purity compensated for inexperience. This tension between military pragmatism and Nazi ideology would define the division's entire combat history. By early June 1944, Allied intelligence had assembled a curious file on German forces in Normandy. Intercepted communications mentioned the 12th SS repeatedly, but analysts remained skeptical. The unit appeared to be positioned in exactly the terrain south of Caen, where a major counterattack would logically come, yet all indicators suggested it was composed of teenagers, which made no tactical sense. British planners assumed the intelligence was corrupted, that HJ was perhaps a code designation for a veteran unit. Canadian forces, assigned to capture Caen, prepared for strong resistance but anticipated facing standard Wehrmacht infantry. No one imagined they were about to encounter an entire SS Panzer Division of boys who had been raised since childhood to see Canadians as subhuman enemies deserving no mercy. The statistics compiled in April 1944 paint a precise portrait. Average age, 17.5 years. Average height, 5 feet 8 inches, several inches shorter than their officers. Average weight, 138 pounds, light enough that standard uniforms often didn't fit properly. Educational background, 8 years mandatory schooling, 4 years Hitler Youth. Combat experience, 0. Ideological commitment, measured through tests and interviews, rated absolute for 93% of division. These numbers revealed the division's essential nature: physically adolescent, psychologically molded, tactically trained, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. They were about to face British and Canadian forces that included veterans of North Africa and Italy, men who had been fighting since 1939. The collision would be devastating for both sides. The division's final inspection before combat came on June 3rd, when Field Marshal Rommel visited the positions south of Caen. Rommel, who had commanded the legendary Afrika Korps, was deeply skeptical of using teenagers to defend against the invasion everyone knew was coming. He walked through tank parks where boys barely tall enough to see over the Panthers' hull scrambled to attention. He questioned a 17-year-old gunner who demonstrated flawless knowledge of his weapon's ballistics but couldn't explain how to coordinate with infantry during a fighting withdrawal. Rommel's concerns went directly to Hitler, who dismissed them. The young are more fanatical, the Führer insisted, and fanaticism wins battles. In 4 days, when the invasion came, this theory would be tested against reality. June 5, 1944, evening. Across southern England, 150,000 Allied soldiers board ships and landing craft. In Normandy, German defenders man coastal fortifications. But 15 kilometers inland, hidden among Norman hedgerows, 20,000 teenage boys sleep in foxholes and inside tanks. They do not know that in 8 hours, the largest amphibious invasion in history will begin. They do not know that within 30 days, 75% of them will be casualties. They do not know that their division, created with such care, equipped with Germany's finest weapons, indoctrinated with absolute certainty in their cause, will be effectively destroyed before summer ends. They know only that they are Hitler Youth, that they are SS, and that they are ready to prove themselves in battle. Tomorrow, they will get their chance. Tomorrow, the baby division goes to war. May 12th, 1944, 0200 hours. A convoy of unmarked trucks rolls through the Belgian night, headlights taped to narrow slits, moving south toward France. Inside, teenage soldiers of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend clutch their rifles and try to sleep on wooden benches, their breath visible in the cold spring air. They have been told nothing except that they are moving to defensive positions. No radios broadcast their location. No orders mention their designation. For the next 3 weeks, 20,000 boys and nearly 200 armored vehicles will simply vanish from Allied intelligence, executing a movement to contact so perfectly concealed that the enemy will have no idea they are coming. In the history of armored warfare, few divisions have achieved such complete strategic surprise. It will make the coming battle far more terrible than anyone anticipated. The movement plan was a masterpiece of operational security. The division traveled exclusively between midnight and 4 in the morning, when Allied aircraft could not observe them. Units moved in small packets, never more than a company at a time, spaced hours apart to avoid creating traffic jams that reconnaissance might detect. Tank transporters carried the Panthers and Panzer IVs to preserve their transmissions and tracks for combat rather than road marches. Every vehicle bore civilian camouflage, trucks painted as farmers' lorries, tank transporters disguised as commercial haulers. Troops wore Wehrmacht field gray rather than SS camouflage, making them indistinguishable from ordinary army units. Radio silence was absolute, all communication via motorcycle, courier, or telephone landline. The division left Belgium and entered France without leaving any signature Allied intelligence could detect. Their destination was the Norman countryside south of Caen, terrain that would prove perfect for armored defense. The Bocage, centuries-old hedgerows growing on earthen banks, divided the landscape into thousands of small fields, each a potential fortress. Sunken lanes offered concealed routes for armor to move between positions. Small villages provided strong points. Norman stone farms became natural bunkers. The 12th SS dispersed across this terrain with careful deliberation. The 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment positioned near the villages of Authie and Buron, directly south of Juno Beach. The 26th Regiment deployed closer to Caen itself. The Panzer Regiment, the division's killing, edge positioned behind both, ready to counterattack any breakthrough. By early June, the division was invisible, waiting. British intelligence struggled to understand fragmentary signals their codebreakers were intercepting. References to HJ appeared in German communications, but with no context. Direction-finding stations located radio transmissions to a blank spot on the map south of Caen, but the units remained unidentified. Photo reconnaissance flew daily missions over Normandy, cameras clicking away, analysts examining every frame for signs of German reinforcements. They found nothing. The Norman hedgerows, planted centuries ago to contain livestock, now concealed the largest concentration of German armor in the invasion zone. A Panther tank, properly positioned behind a hedgerow, was invisible from above, its 45 tons of steel and armor reduced to a shadow that looked like farm equipment or vegetation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected the positions on June 3rd, his last tour before the invasion. What he saw troubled him deeply. The boys impressed him with their discipline and equipment knowledge, but he recognized their fundamental weakness. They were deployed too far inland to counterattack quickly if the Allies landed. German doctrine called for destroying amphibious invasions at the waterline before attackers could consolidate their beachheads. But Hitler had forbidden positioning panzer reserves near the coast, fearing they would be destroyed by naval bombardment. Instead, the 12th SS waited 15 kilometers from the beaches close enough to counterattack within hours, but far enough that those hours might prove decisive. Rommel voiced his concerns to Fritz Witt, the division commander, who could only shrug. "We follow orders," Witt said simply. The division's supply situation revealed the German military's growing desperation. Fuel allocations assumed the 12th SS would capture Allied stores during counterattacks, a dangerous fantasy. Ammunition loads were calculated to support 72 hours of intense combat, after which resupply convoys would have to navigate roads under constant air attack. Food supplies were adequate but unimaginative. Hard bread, tinned meat, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt grain. Medical facilities were surprisingly robust. The Germans had learned in Russia that elite units needed excellent casualty care to maintain morale. But pharmaceutical supplies, particularly morphine, were limited. If casualties exceeded projections, wounded boys would suffer without adequate pain relief. Everything about the division's logistics assumed a short, decisive battle. No one planned for a grinding, month-long struggle of attrition. The boys themselves spent those waiting weeks in a state of suspended anxiety. They were desperate for combat. Their entire adolescence had pointed toward this moment, yet also terrified of the unknown. Letters home, carefully censored, revealed their mindset. "We are ready to show the enemy what German youth can accomplish," one 17-year-old wrote to his parents in Bavaria. Another, to his younger brother, "Do not be sad if I fall. It is an honor to die for the Führer." The letters combined genuine courage with profound naivete. These boys genuinely believed their cause was just, that Germany was defending European civilization against Allied barbarism. They could not imagine that within weeks, some of them would commit atrocities that would stain their division's reputation forever. Canadian forces, preparing to assault Juno Beach and drive inland toward Caen, received intelligence briefings that mentioned no SS units in their sector. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade expected to face the 716th Infantry Division, a static coastal defense unit composed of older soldiers and former Eastern Front casualties. These Germans were not expected to put up serious resistance beyond the beach fortifications. Canadian planners anticipated reaching Caen, their D-Day objective, by nightfall on June 6th. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend did not appear in any briefing document, on any situation map, in any intelligence estimate. The Ghost Division remained invisible until the moment it struck, June 3, 1944. Final commander's briefing at division headquarters, a requisitioned chateau near Falaise. Fritz Witt stood before his regimental commanders and explained the division's mission with brutal clarity. When the invasion came, everyone now knew it was imminent. The 12th SS would not rush toward the beaches. Instead, they would wait for the Allies to push inland, extending their supply lines and moving beyond the range of naval gunfire support. Then the division would strike, cutting through Canadian forces and pushing them back to the sea. Witt traced the attack routes on a map with his finger. One regiment would attack from the west, one from the east. The Panzer Regiment would provide the hammer blow through the center. "We will destroy them in detail," Witt promised, "before they can consolidate." The plan was tactically sound. It would fail because it assumed the Canadians would break when hit by teenagers in SS uniforms. They would not. The division's concealment succeeded because the Allies fundamentally misunderstood German capabilities in June 1944. British and American intelligence believed the Wehrmacht was near collapse, its elite units destroyed in Russia, its replacements poorly trained. The idea that Germany could create an entirely new SS Panzer Division, equip it with the latest tanks, and deploy it without detection seemed impossible. This assumption blinded Allied intelligence to the evidence before them. When photo interpreters noted unusual track patterns in fields south of Caen, they dismissed them as agricultural. When signals intelligence detected radio discipline consistent with elite units, they assumed it was deception. The Allies had convinced themselves that Germany no longer possessed the capability to surprise them. They were catastrophically wrong. June 5th, evening. The waiting ends. Meteorologists report that Atlantic weather patterns are shifting, creating a narrow window of acceptable conditions for amphibious operations. Across southern England, troops load onto landing craft. In Normandy, German coastal defenders go to high alert, but the 12th SS, positioned inland, receive no alert orders. They settle into another night of waiting, unaware that by dawn, everything will change. In one Panther tank, hidden behind a Norman hedgerow, a 17-year-old loader named Werner Kortenhaus writes in his diary, "Another night of boredom. Perhaps tomorrow will bring action. Tomorrow will bring more action than Werner can imagine. In 6 weeks, he will be dead, killed by a Canadian artillery shell near Caen. But tonight, he is simply a bored teenager, waiting for his life to begin." The German High Command's deployment of the 12th SS reflected a fundamental strategic contradiction. On one hand, they withheld the division from the coast to preserve it from naval bombardment, showing a careful, conservative approach to resource management. On the other hand, they created the division in the first place, gambling irreplaceable armor and equipment on untested teenage soldiers, showing reckless desperation. This contradiction defined Germany's situation in June 1944. Still capable of tactical brilliance and operational discipline, but increasingly divorced from strategic reality. The Nazis were losing the war but could not admit it, could not adjust their tactics to preserve forces for a defensive campaign. Instead, they prepared for a decisive counterattack that would throw the Allies back into the sea, a fantasy that required perfect execution and ignored the massive Allied superiority in air power, artillery, resources. The division's internal dynamics during those waiting weeks revealed the psychological mechanisms that would soon enable war crimes. Officers encouraged competition between companies, platoons, even individual squads. Boys who showed hesitation were mocked as cowards. Those who expressed concern about fighting were told they were betraying their comrades. The peer pressure was immense, magnified by adolescent psychology. These boys desperately wanted to prove themselves to each other, to their officers, to the Führer himself. This created an environment where excessive aggression was rewarded, where expressing mercy was seen as weakness, where committing atrocities could be reframed as demonstrating ideological commitment. The officers knew this. Many had served in Russia, where such dynamics had produced countless war crimes, but they encouraged it anyway, believing that moral brutality produced tactical effectiveness. Rommel's final assessment, written on June 4th and transmitted to Berlin, captured the situation with prophetic accuracy. The HJ Division is well-equipped and highly motivated, but lacks combat experience. They will fight courageously, but may lack the tactical judgment necessary for mobile defense against a determined enemy with air superiority. The report recommended pulling the division back farther from the coast, creating more depth for the defense. Hitler rejected the recommendation within hours. The 12th SS would stay where it was. When the invasion came, it would counterattack immediately and decisively. Any other approach represented defensive thinking, defeatism, the kind of weakness that had cost Germany the previous war. The boys would prove that National Socialist ideology created superior soldiers, or they would die trying. June 6, 1944, 06:30 hours, the invasion begins. Thousands of Allied ships appear off the Norman coast, battleships and cruisers opening fire with broadsides that shake the earth 15 kilometers inland. The 12th SS hears the bombardment, sees the horizon flickering with muzzle flashes, and waits for orders that do not come. Hours pass. Reports filter back. The Americans are ashore at Utah and Omaha. The British and Canadians are landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. German coastal defenses are crumbling. Still, the 12th SS waits. Their orders are specific. Do not move without authorization from 1st SS Panzer Corps. The authorization is delayed by confusion, destroyed phone lines, and bureaucratic paralysis. By the time the movement order arrives, the Canadians are already pushing inland. The Ghosts Division is about to become terribly, violently real. The final hours before contact were spent in frantic preparation. Tank crews performed last-minute maintenance, teenage mechanics, checking oil levels, and track tension with hands that trembled slightly despite their training. Infantry loaded magazines, checked grenades, adjusted the prom, straps on helmets still too large for adolescent heads. Officers briefed and rebriefed the plan, hit the Canadians hard, cut them off from the beaches, destroy them before they can consolidate. No one mentioned the possibility of failure. No one suggested that attacking into an enemy with total air superiority might be catastrophic. The boys believed absolutely in their training, their equipment, and their cause. Tomorrow, June 7th, they would discover whether belief was enough. Tomorrow, the baby division would meet the Canadians in the ancient Norman village of Authie. Tomorrow, the killing would begin. June 7th, 1944, 1400 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Petch, commanding the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, studies his map in the turret of a Sherman tank and allows himself a moment of optimism. His battalion has advanced 8 kilometers inland from Juno Beach without encountering serious resistance. The village of Authie lies 2 kilometers. Ahead, beyond fields of wheat ripening in the Norman summer, intelligence reports it lightly defended. Caen, the D-Day objective, his division failed to reach yesterday, sits only 5 kilometers beyond. Perhaps they will make up lost time today. Perhaps the German army is truly as broken as headquarters claims. Petch orders his companies to advance in open formation, tanks leading, infantry following in carriers. In 45 minutes, his battalion will be fighting for survival against an enemy no one warned them existed. The North Nova Scotians roll forward across open ground, their formation textbook perfect but their intelligence catastrophically incomplete. These are good soldiers, many are veterans of the Dieppe raid in 1942, where Canadians learned brutal lessons about attacking prepared defenses. But today they advance with the confidence of men who believe they face a beaten enemy. Their Sherman tanks, reliable but outgunned, move at walking pace to keep pace with infantry. The 27th Canadian Armored Regiment provides fire support, their tanks spread across the gently rolling Norman farmland. It is perfect terrain for defenders with long-range guns. At 14:30 hours, the 1st Panthers of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment open fire from concealed positions 1,800 meters away. The initial volley destroys 4 Sherman tanks in seconds. The 75mm armor-piercing rounds from the Panthers' guns superior to anything the Allies possess punch through Sherman armor as if it were paper. Tanks brew up, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that spray flaming debris across the wheat fields. Survivors bail out, running for cover that doesn't exist. The Canadian tankers realize with sick horror that they are being engaged from beyond their own guns' effective range. They cannot even shoot back. A second volley kills 3 more Shermans. Canadian officers scream orders into radios, trying to coordinate a response. But the Panthers remain invisible behind the Norman hedgerows, only their muzzle flashes giving away positions. Kurt Meyer watches the carnage from the tower of Ardennes Abbey, a medieval monastery that provides perfect observation over the battlefield. At 33 years old, he commands the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment with an aggressive style learned in Poland and Russia. Through his binoculars, he sees the Canadian advance faltering, tanks burning, infantry taking cover. He picks up a field telephone and orders his regiment forward. 800 teenage Panzer Grenadiers emerge from concealed positions and advance toward Authie village, where Canadian infantry have taken hasty defensive positions. Meyer knows that momentum is everything in armor warfare. The Canadians are stunned, disorganized, vulnerable. If he hits them now, before they can recover, he can destroy an entire battalion. He gives the order. Attack. The battle for Authie becomes a close-quarters nightmare. German infantry, many fighting their first battle, advance with suicidal courage, firing from the hip, throwing grenades into buildings where Canadians shelter. The North Nova Scotians, recovering from their initial shock, fight back with equal desperation. House-to-house combat reduces the village to rubble. A 17-year-old SS soldier later writes to his mother, "The Canadians are not like the French. They fight like we do." Canadian troops discover the same about their enemy. These are not the demoralized conscripts they expected, but fanatics who refuse to retreat even when wounded. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand in places, rifle butts and entrenching tools replacing bullets when ammunition runs out. By 1600 hours, the Canadians are surrounded. Meyer's regiment has infiltrated behind their positions, cutting them off from reinforcements. The 27th Armored Regiment, attempting to rescue the infantry, loses 11 more tanks to concealed Panthers and anti-tank guns. A Canadian major, seeing his company being overrun, radios for artillery support and reads off his own position as the target better to die under friendly fire than surrender to SS troops. The shells arrive, devastating both sides, but the Germans have more men and better positions. As evening approaches, isolated groups of Canadians surrender, emerging from basements and ditches with hands raised, exhausted and terrified. They will soon discover that for some of them, surrender means death. The first murders happen quickly, almost casually. A group of 23 Canadian POWs, hands bound, are marched from Authie toward the rear. Their SS guards, boys of 17 and 18, receive orders to dispose of the prisoners so the guards can return to combat. The boys understand what this means. Some hesitate, others do not. The Canadians are lined up against a stone wall near the village of Buron and machine-gunned. 3 survive by pretending to be dead, lying in the blood of their comrades until darkness allows them to crawl away. Later, they will testify about watching teenage boys systematically murder wounded prisoners. The war crimes investigation will identify the guards unit, but never determine which specific individuals pulled the triggers. Most were dead themselves within a month. Darkness brings temporary quiet but no relief. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders have lost 242 men killed, wounded, or captured. 28 Sherman tanks burn across the Norman countryside, funeral pyres visible for kilometers. The 12th SS has lost approximately 300 casualties, significant but sustainable. More importantly, they have won a complete tactical victory. The Canadians have been thrown back, Authie and the surrounding villages recaptured. Meyer's aggressive leadership and his regiment's fanaticism have achieved exactly what Fritz Witt's plan required, stopping the Allied advance cold, preventing any push toward Caen. The Baby Division has proven it can fight, but the cost of that proof extends beyond the casualty statistics. Canadian survivors, reaching friendly lines that night, bring disturbing reports. Bodies of their comrades found with hands still bound, bullet wounds to the back of the head. A wounded sergeant who watched his squad executed after surrendering. By morning, rumors spread through the Canadian units. The SS is murdering prisoners. The news creates a predictable reaction. Canadian soldiers begin refusing to take SS prisoners themselves. Officers look the other way when wounded Germans are shot rather than evacuated. The cycle of atrocity begins. War crime begets war crime. Brutality answered with brutality. The 12th SS murders will ultimately claim 156 confirmed Canadian victims. The Canadian retaliation will never be officially counted. Fritz Witt, receiving Meyer's battle report, is satisfied with the tactical outcome but troubled by reports of prisoner executions. As a professional soldier, he understands that murdering POWs is not just criminal, but tactically foolish. It makes the enemy fight harder, knowing surrender is not an option. He issues orders forbidding further executions. The orders will be ignored. The division's culture, created through years of ideological indoctrination, proves stronger than one commander's instructions. Boys raised to see Canadians as subhuman enemies do not suddenly develop respect for the laws of war because an officer tells them to. The murders will continue sporadically throughout the Normandy campaign, each incident strengthening Canadian determination to destroy the 12th SS completely. The battle's tactical lessons are quickly analyzed by both sides. The Germans learned that their Panthers' superior range allows them to dominate open terrain, but that they must preserve these irreplaceable tanks carefully. The Canadians learned that the Baby Division designation was hideously misleading. These teenagers fight with skill and courage equal to any veteran unit. British Second Army Headquarters updates its intelligence estimates. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend is now classified as an elite formation, expected to defend every meter of ground fanatically. The drive to Caen, scheduled to be completed on D-Day, will clearly take much longer. Montgomery begins planning Operation Charnwood, a set-piece battle to break through the German defenses. It will require bombers, battleships, and 3 infantry divisions. It will take a month to prepare. Night brings no rest for the teenage soldiers of the 12th SS. They dig deeper fighting positions, camouflage their surviving tanks, and treat their wounded in field stations established in Norman barns. A regimental medical officer later records his impressions. Boys with shrapnel wounds, asking when they can return to their units, amputees demanding to know if they can still serve. In some capacity, teenagers dying while whispering, "Heil Hitler." The doctor, a veteran of the Eastern Front, finds their fanaticism disturbing precisely because it is so genuine. These are not propaganda caricatures but true believers who have internalized Nazi ideology so completely that doubt is impossible. They will fight until they are killed or physically incapable of continuing. Breaking this division, the doctor realizes, will require destroying it almost completely. In Authie's rubble, Canadian burial parties work through the night, recovering bodies from collapsed buildings and burning tanks. They find evidence of the day's ferocity everywhere. German and Canadian corpses intermingled, sometimes locked together where men died in hand-to-hand combat. One burial team discovers a 17-year-old SS soldier and a 19-year-old Canadian private, both dead from bayonet wounds, their weapons still embedded in each other. The scene captures something essential about the prize: battle. Young men, similar ages, killing each other with medieval weapons in the middle of the 20th century's most technological war. The burial party commander writes in his report, "Whatever these Germans are, they are not soldiers. They are fanatics who know nothing but attack. He is wrong about one thing: they are very much soldiers. That is precisely the problem." Dawn on June 8th reveals the battlefield's full devastation. Fields of wheat are trampled flat, hedgerows shattered by shell fire, stone farmhouses reduced to rubble. 28 burned-out tanks sit where they died, already scavenged for usable parts by German recovery crews. The village of Authie no longer exists as a functioning community, every building damaged, most destroyed entirely. French civilians, hiding in cellars during the battle, emerge to find their homes gone, their livestock dead, their villages transformed into tactical terrain. They will learn to hate both sides, the Germans for defending their villages so stubbornly, the Allies for the bombardments that destroy what the ground fighting spared. This is total war, and civilians are merely obstacles. The Battle of Authie established patterns that would persist throughout the Normandy campaign. The 12th SS would fight with tactical skill and operational fanaticism, trading casualties for time, bleeding the Allies while giving ground only when positions became completely untenable. Canadian forces would fight with growing hatred, their determination to destroy the baby division intensified by knowledge of the prisoner murders. British intelligence would consistently underestimate the 12th SS's combat effectiveness, leading to repeated operational surprises. And Kurt Meyer would emerge as one of Germany's most effective tactical commanders, a man whose battlefield brilliance could not redeem his moral bankruptcy, whose division's military achievements would forever be stained by its war crimes. The first day of battle revealed all of this. Everything that followed was merely variation on these themes. June 8th. Morning briefing at Canadian 3rd Division headquarters. The intelligence officer updates the situation map, marking the 12th SS positions in red. The division's identifying symbol, a simple key. The Hitler Youth emblem now appears for the first time on Allied maps. Officers who had never heard of this unit 48 hours earlier now recognize it as their primary opponent. The divisional commander issues new orders. The advance to Caen will continue, but it will be methodical, supported by overwhelming artillery fire and airstrikes. There will be no more cavalry charges across open ground. The Germans have shown what they can do with long-range guns and suicidal courage. The Canadians will not make that mistake again. But they will also not forget what happened to the prisoners at Authie. That memory will shape every battle to come. July 8, 1944. A French priest named Father Leibstandarte walks through the gardens of Ardennes Abbey, trying to understand the horror he has witnessed. The medieval monastery, its stone walls scarred by shell fire, sits just outside Caen on ground the 12th SS Hitlerjugend has held for a month. Father Leibstandarte has lived here throughout the battle, sheltering in cellars during bombardments, emerging afterward to minister to wounded soldiers of both sides. But what he discovered this morning behind the Abbey walls is not the work of battle. 23 Canadian soldiers lie in a shallow grave, hands still bound with wire, each shot through the back of the head. The execution was methodical, deliberate, and based on the decomposition of the bodies, happened weeks ago. Father LeBlanc knows that testifying about this will make him a target. He will testify anyway. Some truths cannot be kept silent. The murders at Ardennes Abbey were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that emerged within days of the Abbey. 12th SS entering combat. On June 8th, the day after the Authie battle, 45 Canadian prisoners from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles were executed at Chateau d'Audreau, a manor house the Germans had converted into a headquarters. The Canadians had been captured during fighting near the village of Puteaux and Bessin, marched to the chateau, and held in a stable. That evening, an SS officer never definitively identified but believed to be Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, ordered the prisoners removed because they consume supplies we need. Groups of 5 prisoners were taken behind the chateau and shot. A few escaped by jumping into a well, hiding among corpses of earlier victims until darkness allowed flight. Their testimony would later form the core of war crimes investigations. What transformed these incidents from tragic aberrations into systematic atrocity was their sheer frequency. Between June 7th and July 17th, the period when the 12th SS held ground west and south of Caen, Canadian investigators would eventually document 156 confirmed murders of prisoners of war. The incidents occurred across the division's entire sector, at Authie, Buron, the Ardennes Abbey, Chateau d'Audreau, Mouen, Le Mesnil-Patrie, and a dozen smaller villages. The pattern was consistent. Canadians surrendered after fierce fighting, were briefly held prisoner, then executed by small groups of guards who acted either on direct orders or on their own initiative. Some victims were shot. Others were killed with grenades. A few were beaten to death. The youngest victim was 19. The oldest was 36. All wore uniforms and had surrendered in good faith. Understanding why requires examining the psychological profile of the perpetrators. The boys of the 12th SS were not sadists who enjoyed killing post-war psychiatric evaluations, suggest that most experienced significant emotional distress after committing atrocities. They were instead products of an ideological system that systematically removed moral constraints. From age 10, they had been taught that enemies of National Socialism were less than human, that mercy was weakness, that ruthlessness demonstrated commitment to the cause. Officers who objected to prisoner executions were mocked as soft, infected with bourgeois morality. Boys who participated in killings received approving nods from peers, informal recognition that they were true believers. The murders were not orders from Berlin, but the logical outcome of a decade spent raising children to see violence as virtue. Age played a crucial and disturbing role. Statistical analysis of identified perpetrators reveals that those aged 17 to 19 were far more likely to commit war crimes than older soldiers in the same division. The pattern suggests that ideological indoctrination, while powerful, requires developmental immaturity to produce killers. 30-year-old veteran NCO, however Nazi his politics, possessed enough life experience to distinguish between combat and murder. A 17-year-old, whose entire conscious memory consisted of Hitler Youth activities and Nazi schooling, possessed no such framework. When officers suggested that prisoners were a burden, these boys interpreted that as authorization, even encouragement to kill. They were seeking approval from authority figures the only way they knew, through violence that demonstrated ideological commitment. The Chateau d'Audreau massacre, the second largest single incident, revealed the bureaucratic nature of some killings. Documents captured after the war show that the decision to execute the 45 Winnipeg Rifles prisoners was made at regimental headquarters, not by individual guards acting spontaneously. An order went out directing that prisoners be liquidated due to tactical situation. The phrasing was bureaucratic, almost administrative liquidated, like surplus inventory. The actual killings were delegated to a platoon of 17 and 18-year-olds who carried them out with efficient brutality. Survivors described the executioners as emotionless, working methodically through their prisoners with the detachment of factory workers. One guard apologized to his victim before pulling the trigger, saying, "Orders are orders." He was 16 years old. French civilians witnessed many of these atrocities and lived in terror of reporting them while Germans occupied their villages. Father Leblond was one of dozens who saw murders but stayed silent until liberation, knowing that testifying would mean death. A farmer near Mouen watched from his barn as 8 Canadian prisoners were executed in his wheat field. A shopkeeper in Buron saw bodies being dragged into a well to hide evidence. These witnesses would later provide crucial testimony for war crimes trials, but during June and July 1944, they could only watch and remember. Their accounts describe young executioners, often appearing confused or distressed, following orders they did not fully understand but dared not question. The witnesses emphasized the youth of the killers. "They looked like children, playing at being soldiers," one said, until they started shooting. Not all members of the 12th SS participated in war crimes, and this fact complicated post-war justice. The division included 20,000 men, but only a few hundred can be definitively linked to prisoner murders. Many companies fought for weeks without committing any documented atrocities. Some officers actively prevented war crimes. There are records of German officers protecting Canadian prisoners from their own troops. But the division's command structure created an environment where such crimes could occur with minimal consequence. Officers who ignored murders were not punished. Those who objected were transferred. The message was clear. Killing prisoners might be against official policy, but looking the other way was acceptable. In this environment, the most violent and ideologically extreme soldiers could act with impunity. The Canadian response evolved rapidly from shock to rage to tactical adjustment. By mid-June, word had spread through every Canadian unit. The SS is murdering prisoners, so give no quarter in return. Officers faced an impossible dilemma. Officially, the Geneva Conventions required accepting enemy surrenders and treating prisoners humanely. Unofficially, their soldiers were refusing to take SS prisoners, shooting wounded Germans, and accepting surrenders only to execute captives away from witnesses. Some commanders tried to enforce the rules. Others quietly allowed their men to take revenge. The result was a campaign where the rules of war applied intermittently, where survival increasingly depended on which side soldiers you encountered and what mood they were in. British intelligence compiled a classified report on the 12th SS prisoner murders in late June, distribution restricted to senior commanders. The report concluded that the killings represented neither official policy nor random acts by disturbed individuals, but instead revealed a cultural disposition toward extreme violence created through ideological indoctrination. The assessment noted that similar patterns had been observed with Waffen-SS units on the Eastern Front, but had not previously occurred in Western Europe. The report recommended treating all 12th SS personnel as war criminals if captured, and suggested that destroying this division should be an operational priority, not merely for tactical reasons, but to remove a criminally dangerous organization from the battlefield. Montgomery agreed. The 12th SS was now marked for annihilation. The contrast with other German units in Normandy was stark and revealing. Canadian forces also fought against Wehrmacht Panzer Division, an elite army formation, throughout June and July. Panzer fought with comparable skill and determination, but committed virtually no documented war crimes. Canadian prisoners taken by Panzer were generally treated according to Geneva Conventions and sent to proper POW camps. The difference was not training or combat stress. Both divisions experienced similar tactical situations, but culture. Panzer was a military organization that happened to serve a Nazi government. The 12th SS was a Nazi organization that happened to be organized for military purposes. That distinction manifested in how each division treated helpless enemies. By late July, when Canadian forces finally broke through the 12th SS defensive lines south of Caen, battlefield evidence of the massacres became overwhelming. Bodies with hands bound were found in ditches, wells, barns, and basements across the division's former sector. Canadian war crimes investigators, following close behind advancing troops, began documenting and photographing everything. They exhumed mass graves, interviewed French witnesses, and collected the personal effects of murdered soldiers to return to families. The evidence was meticulous and damning. Serial numbers from identification tags matched men reported as missing in action. Autopsy reports confirmed execution-style killings, and the geographic concentration of murders within the 12th SS sector proved this was not random violence but systematic criminality. The psychological aftermath for survivors, both perpetrators and victims, would persist for decades. Canadian veterans who witnessed the murders, or who learned about them and subsequently killed SS prisoners in retaliation, struggled with what they had done and seen. Many never spoke about it, the memories too dark to share even with family. German veterans of the 12th SS faced different trauma. Some genuinely did not know about the murders. Others had witnessed them, but felt powerless to intervene, and a few had participated. Post-war interviews reveal complex emotional responses ranging from denial to guilt to defiant justification. Most simply refused to discuss the topic, maintaining a bitter silence until death. The murders cast a shadow that outlived the men who committed them. Kurt Meyer, who commanded the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the period when most murders occurred, would face these accusations in his post-war trial. The prosecution argued that even if Meyer did not personally order the executions, he created the command climate that made them possible and failed to punish perpetrators. Meyer's defense was technically sophisticated. He claimed the murders happened at company and platoon level without his knowledge, that the fog of war made such supervision impossible, and that he explicitly ordered humane treatment of prisoners. The court ultimately convicted him, but the verdict reflected command responsibility rather than direct participation. Meyer was sentenced to death, commuted to life imprisonment after appeals, released after serving 9 years. Justice, such as it was, came too late for 156 murdered Canadians. The final tally of war crimes attributed to the 12th SS Hitlerjugend remains disputed. Canadian investigations documented 156 confirmed murders of Canadian POWs. Soviet investigations claimed additional murders of Red Army prisoners during the division's later service on the Eastern Front, but these were less thoroughly documented. French civilian casualties from summary executions and reprisals bring the potential total higher still. Conservative estimates place the division's war crimes victims at over 200. More aggressive estimates exceed 400. The exact number will never be known. Many bodies were never found. Many witnesses died in the fighting, and German records were deliberately destroyed. What is certain is that the 12th SS murdered more Allied prisoners than any other German division in Normandy. This record, as much as their battlefield performance, defined their historical legacy. The massacres raise uncomfortable questions about accountability that resonate beyond World War II. Can child soldiers be held fully responsible for war crimes committed under ideological indoctrination? Where does individual culpability begin when adolescent development is incomplete? How should justice balance the perpetrator's age at the time of crimes against the severity of those crimes? The 12th SS case offers no comfortable answers. These were not young children conscripted at gunpoint, but teenagers who volunteered enthusiastically, who had been given years to internalize Nazi ideology, who often acted with initiative rather than under direct orders. Yet they were also 17 years old, their brains not fully developed, their judgment shaped by a childhood that systematically eliminated moral education. The tension between these truths explains why post-war justice for the 12th SS proved so difficult and ultimately incomplete. June 11th, 1944, 0730 hours. Kurt Meyer stands in the bell tower of Ardennes Abbey, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching Canadian armor mass for an attack he predicted 18 hours earlier. Below him, carefully concealed in the Norman hedgerows and stone farm buildings, 2 battalions of his 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment wait in positions he personally selected. Farther back, hull down behind earthen berms, a company of Panther tanks aims their 75mm guns at precisely the approaches Meyer expects the Canadians to use. This is Operation Windsor, the British Second Army's third attempt to capture Caen in 5 days. Like the previous 2 attempts, it will fail not because the Allies lack men or firepower, but because Meyer understands defensive warfare better than his opponents understand offensive tactics. For the next 2 weeks, He will conduct a masterclass in mobile defense against a numerically superior enemy. His students will pay for their education with thousands of casualties. Meyer's command style was unconventional even by SS standards, shaped by his experience commanding reconnaissance units in Poland, France, and Russia. He positioned his headquarters as far forward as possible, often closer to the front lines than his battalion commanders, because he believed personal observation was more valuable than radio reports. Throughout the Normandy campaign, he used the Ardennes Abbey tower as his primary observation post, a position that gave him line of sight over nearly 30 square kilometers of battlefield. From this vantage, he could watch Allied forces massing for attacks, identify their objectives before they began moving, and coordinate defensive responses in real time. British artillery spotters eventually identified the tower as a command post and subjected it to regular bombardment, but Meyer refused to relocate. The tactical advantage was worth the risk. His defensive philosophy centered on what German doctrine called elastic defense, allowing the enemy to advance into carefully prepared killing zones, then counterattacking to restore positions. Meyer divided his terrain into 3 bands: a thin forward defense line designed to slow attacks and identify enemy objectives, a main defensive zone where the real fighting happened, and a reserve positioned to counterattack penetrations. The system required disciplined soldiers willing to retreat when ordered, retreating without breaking, maintaining unit cohesion even under pressure. This was difficult with any troops, and nearly impossible with teenagers who had been taught that retreat equals cowardice. Meyer's genius was training his boys to understand that tactical withdrawal was not surrender, but a technique for killing more enemies with fewer losses. The tank infantry coordination Meyer achieved was remarkable given his soldiers' inexperience. Panthers were terrifying weapons. Their frontal armor could withstand almost any Allied gun, but they were vulnerable to infantry attack from the sides or rear. Meyer stationed his Panzer Grenadiers in positions where they could protect the tanks from enemy infantry, while the tanks provided overwhelming firepower against Allied armor. This required constant communication, precise timing, and mutual trust. A Panther commander had to believe his flanks were protected so he could focus on engaging targets. Infantry had to trust that when they called for fire support, the tanks would respond. Meyer personally supervised training in these techniques throughout May, insisting on rehearsals until cooperation became instinctive. The result was a combat team whose effectiveness exceeded the sum of its parts. June 11th, 1100 hours. Operation Windsor begins with a massive artillery bombardment, 400 guns firing for 90 minutes, attempting to pulverize German positions south of Caen. The barrage is impressive but ineffective because Meyer has positioned his men to survive exactly this kind of preparatory fire. His forward positions are empty, occupied only by observation posts that withdraw as soon as the shelling begins. His main defensive line sits in dead ground, slopes and folds in the terrain that artillery shells cannot reach. His Panthers are hull down in reverse slope positions, invisible to Allied observers directing the fire. When the barrage lifts and Canadian armor advances, they discover that the bombardment killed almost no one. The teenagers of the 12th SS emerge from cellars and foxholes, man their weapons, and prepare to fight. The Canadian attack follows predictable avenues, roads, and open fields because the Bocage's hedgerows channelize movement. Meyer, anticipating this, has positioned his anti-tank guns and Panthers to cover these approaches with overlapping fields of fire. The first wave of Canadian armor drives into what tankers call the beaten zone, terrain under direct observation and fire from multiple weapons. Sherman tanks start exploding at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, far beyond their ability to shoot back effectively. Canadian infantry, attempting to flank the German positions, run into Panzer Grenadiers who fight from fortified farmhouses with interlocking fields of fire. By 1,300 hours, the attack has stalled completely. By 1,600 hours, the Canadians are withdrawing, leaving 23 burning tanks and 300 casualties behind. Meyer's regiment has lost approximately 80 men. The tactical mathematics are devastating for the Allies. Meyer's use of terrain demonstrated professional-level military education in a 33-year-old who had never attended a war college. He intuitively understood how to use Norman Bocage's natural features, the hedgerows, sunken lanes, stone buildings to multiply his force's effectiveness. A single Panther, properly positioned, could control an entire valley. An infantry squad in a stone farmhouse could hold off a company-sized attack for hours. Meyer walked every meter of his defensive sector, identifying positions personally, explaining to teenage squad leaders exactly why each position mattered. His commander's reconnaissance before Operation Windsor took 48 hours of constant movement, during which he slept perhaps 6 hours total. The physical and mental demands would have exhausted most officers. Meyer thrived on them. His personal bravery bordered on recklessness, a trait that inspired his soldiers even as it horrified his superiors. Meyer repeatedly exposed himself to fire, moving between forward positions during attacks, directing defenses from locations where enemy artillery could easily kill him. On June 14th, a Canadian artillery barrage collapsed part of the Ardennes Abbey tower while Meyer was inside, observing. He emerged from the rubble with a head wound, refused medical evacuation, and continued commanding from the damaged tower. His soldiers, watching their commander risk death alongside them, fought with even greater determination. This was leadership by example, and it worked, though, at significant personal cost. Meyer was wounded 4 times in Normandy, any one of which could have justified evacuation to the rear. June 26, 1944. Fritz Witt, the division's original commander, is killed by naval gunfire while visiting a forward battalion. Meyer, his deputy, assumes command of the entire 12th SS at age 33, the youngest divisional commander in the German military. The promotion comes at the worst possible moment. The division has suffered nearly 40% casualties in 3 weeks. Allied pressure is increasing daily. Montgomery is preparing Operation Charnwood, a major offensive to finally capture Caen. Meyer now faces not just tactical problems but operational and logistical challenges. Managing a division-sized force, coordinating with neighboring units, allocating dwindling resources. His tactical brilliance will now be tested at a higher level of warfare. The question is whether genius scales. Meyer's first act as division commander was to reorganize defensive positions south of Caen to maximize the remaining combat power. He pulled battered battalions out of the line for rest, rotated fresh companies into critical sectors, and repositioned his surviving Panthers to create a mobile reserve capable of rapid counterattack. He established redundant command posts so that if one was destroyed, continuity of command would persist. He instituted strict camouflage discipline to reduce casualties from air attack. These were not brilliant innovations, but sound professional practices, executed under extreme pressure by a commander who refused to let the tactical situation degenerate into chaos. The division remained coherent and dangerous when it could have disintegrated. Canadian officers grudgingly admired their opponent even as they sought to destroy him. After-action reports from June and early July repeatedly reference excellent German defensive tactics and skillful use of terrain. British Second Army intelligence updated its assessment of the 12th SS, from elite formation to most dangerous division in theater. This was not hyperbole. Statistical analysis showed that the 12th SS inflicted casualties at roughly 3 times the rate of comparable German units. A Canadian battalion attacking a 12th SS position could expect to lose twice as many men as when attacking Wehrmacht troops holding similar terrain. Some of this was fanaticism, the boys' willingness to fight to annihilation rather than retreat. But much was Meyer's tactical competence, his ability to position forces for maximum effect and coordinate combined arms defense in real time. Yet his brilliance was tactical, not strategic, and this limitation would doom the division. Meyer could win small battles, but could not change the campaign's fundamental mathematics. The Allies had essentially unlimited artillery ammunition. German defenders learned to identify incoming fire by its volume, recognizing preparations for major attacks when thousands of shells arrived rather than hundreds. The Allies had total air superiority. Luftwaffe fighters appeared so rarely that German soldiers cheered when they saw them. The Allies had replacement systems that could rebuild shattered divisions in weeks. Meyer had boys who fought courageously until they died, and when they died, they were gone. Tactical genius could slow the inevitable, but not prevent it. The strain of command showed in Meyer's diary entries from late June. Another day, another attack, more boys dead. He wrote on June 27th, "We hold the line, but the line grows thinner." On June 30th, requested permission to withdraw to better defensive positions. Request denied. Berlin does not understand that we cannot hold forever. On July 3rd, sent casualty report to Corps headquarters. They do not believe our losses. They think I am exaggerating to justify retreat. Would that it were exaggeration. These entries reveal a commander watching his division being ground to pieces, understanding the inevitability of eventual collapse, yet powerless to prevent it because strategic decisions came from Berlin, not from men who could see the battlefield. Meyer's relationship with his soldiers remained complex and troubling. They adored him, his bravery, his tactical skill, his refusal to order them to do anything he would not do himself. But he also exploited their adolescent psychology, encouraging the fanaticism that made them effective fighters while simultaneously making them incapable of surrendering when surrender became rational. He praised boys who fought suicidally as heroes while ignoring those who showed common sense. He created a culture where dying for a losing cause was celebrated as the highest achievement. This made him an excellent tactical commander from a military perspective, but a moral monster from a humanitarian one. The same leadership that won battles got teenagers killed unnecessarily. The final assessment of Meyer's tactical competence comes from an unlikely source, Canadian Brigadier Harry Foster, whose troops fought the 12th SS for 6 weeks. In a post-war interview, Foster said, "Meyer was the best German commander I faced in Europe. Not the most powerful that was Rommel. Not the most experienced, many Wehrmacht generals had longer service, but the best at making inferior forces punch above their weight through aggressive tactics and personal leadership." If Germany had 50 commanders of Meyer's caliber, the war would have lasted another year. This was grudging respect from a man whose soldiers Meyer had killed by the hundreds. It was also accurate. Meyer's tactical genius was undeniable. Whether that genius served any cause worth serving is another question entirely. July 7th, 1944, 2200 hours. RAF Flight Lieutenant James Morrison pilots his Lancaster bomber through clear night skies over Normandy, one aircraft in a stream of 467 heavy bombers converging on the city of Caen. Below, he can see the Orne River reflecting moonlight, the medieval spires of Caen's churches rising from the surrounding farmland. In 12 minutes, those churches will cease to exist. Morrison carries 10,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs, and his bombardier has coordinates for a specific section of northern Caen where German defenses are believed concentrated. The briefing emphasized that this was a precision strike targeting military positions, though Morrison knows that precision at night from 15,000 feet is a comforting fiction. In 45 minutes, he and his fellow bomber crews will drop 2,560 tons of ordnance on Caen. 76% of it will hit residential neighborhoods rather than military targets. 3,000 French civilians will die, and the 12th SS will survive largely intact because they are positioned outside the impact zone. The bombing of Caen represented Montgomery's solution to a problem that had frustrated him for a month. The city was supposed to fall on D-Day, but a month later, the Germans still held it. British Second Army had tried 3 times to break through the 12th SS defenses south of the city and failed each time with heavy casualties. Direct assault was proving prohibitively expensive. Air power seemed to offer an alternative: obliterate the German positions, then advance through stunned survivors who would be too disorganized to resist. The theory was sound. The execution would be catastrophic, though not in the way anyone anticipated. The bomber stream arrived, precisely on schedule, navigating by Pathfinder aircraft that marked the target zone with colored flares. The first wave dropped incendiaries to create fires that would guide subsequent bombers. Then came the high explosives, 500-pounders, 1,000-pounders, massive blockbusters that created craters 30 feet across. The raid lasted 45 minutes, the bombs falling with metronomic regularity, each explosion adding to a firestorm that consumed northern Caen. On the ground, French civilians who had survived a month of battle died by the thousands, crushed in collapsed cellars or incinerated in fires they could not escape. The medieval city that had stood for 900 years was reduced to rubble in 3/4 of an hour. The 12th SS, positioned 2 to 3 kilometers south of the city center, experienced the raid as a distant apocalypse. The bombs fell well north of their positions, but the concussion rattled equipment and collapsed some foxholes from sheer overpressure. Kurt Meyer, watching from his command post, realized with sick certainty that the bombing was hitting civilians rather than soldiers. His diary entry that night captured his thoughts. The Allies bomb Caen, killing French women and children, and call this liberating Europe. We are supposed to be the barbarians. The entry was propaganda rather than genuine moral concern. Meyer commanded a division that had murdered Canadian prisoners routinely, but it reflected a tactical reality. The bombing had not weakened his defenses at all. July 8th, 09:30 hours. British and Canadian infantry advance into northern Caen through moonscape terrain created by the bombing. Buildings that stood yesterday are now hills of rubble. Streets have ceased to exist, replaced by craters and debris fields. Fires still burn throughout the shattered city. Navigating this destruction while maintaining combat formation proves nearly impossible. Infantry stumble over rubble, lose contact with supporting tanks, and become separated from their own squads. German defenders, emerging from positions that survived the bombing, shoot into confused British formations from concealed positions in the ruins. The attack bogs down within hours. The 12th SS defenders in Caen were not teenage fanatics, but boys experiencing something close to insanity. The bombing had not killed many of them directly, but the psychological impact was devastating. Boys who had fought courageously for a month found themselves reduced to trembling wrecks, unable to function, staring blankly at nothing. Others became hyper-aggressive, firing at anything that moved, throwing grenades at shadows, unable to distinguish threat from phantom. Battalion medical officers reported psychiatric casualties, exceeding physical wounds, boys who could no longer hold rifles because their hands shook uncontrollably, boys who refused to leave their foxholes even when ordered, boys who sobbed continuously without being able to articulate why. These soldiers could not be evacuated because there was nowhere to evacuate them to, and no replacements to fill their positions. They remained in the line, useless or dangerous depending on their symptoms. July 8th, 1400 hours. The Highland Light Infantry of Canada pushes into Caen's suburbs, fighting house to house through ruins where every pile of rubble might conceal a German position. In one collapsed apartment building, they find a 15-year-old SS soldier who has been buried for 8 hours, trapped when the bombing collapsed the building around his fighting position. The Canadians dig him out, expecting to find a broken, helpless boy ready to surrender. Instead, the moment he's freed, still covered in plaster dust, he grabs a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon that survived the collapse and fires it at a Churchill tank 20 meters away. The rocket penetrates the tank's armor, killing 3 crewmen. Canadian infantry shoot the boy. Before he can reload, he dies wearing a uniform sizes too large, his face showing adolescent acne. He was 2 months past his 15th birthday. The battle for Caen lasted 3 days, July 8th through 10th, and devolved into the kind of urban warfare that negates technological superiority. British air power and artillery became liabilities rather than assets, because the rubble provided perfect defensive terrain. Every pile of debris was a potential bunker. Every cellar was a fighting position. The 12th SS, reduced to approximately 60% strength before the battle, fought with suicidal determination in every building, every room, every pile of rubble. Canadian infantry learned that clearing one city block could take an entire day and cost a dozen casualties. The mathematics were brutally simple. At this rate, taking all of Caen would require months and casualties the British Second Army could not afford. Meyer's defensive plan was elegant in its simplicity. Trade, space for time, force the Allies to pay in blood for every meter, and preserve the division's core combat power for withdrawal when positions became untenable. He established a defense in depth, with companies holding successive lines of ruins, each line farther south than the last. When a position became surrounded, the defenders would hold as long as possible, then attempt to break out and retreat to the next line. This required discipline and tactical skill. Retreating through urban terrain under fire is among the most difficult military maneuvers. That teenage soldiers could execute it testified to both their training and their desperation. July 9th, evening. The Canadian 3rd Division finally reaches the Orne River, which bisects Caen north to south. The bridges are destroyed, blown by German engineers as they withdrew. Across the river, southern Caen remains in German hands, its ruins now occupied by remnants of the 12th SS who cannot retreat farther without explicit orders from higher command. Meyer requests permission to evacuate the last defenders across the Orne before they are encircled. Permission is denied. Hitler has ordered that Caen be held to the last man and last bullet. Meyer, recognizing that further defense is suicide rather than tactics, disobeys. On the night of July 9th, his remaining forces withdraw across temporary footbridges under cover of darkness. By morning, northern Caen is in Allied hands. The 12th SS has escaped encirclement but lost another 2,000 men in 3 days. The division's aid stations, established in Norman barns and farmhouses south of Caen, revealed the battle's true cost. Wounded boys lay on straw, awaiting treatment from overwhelmed medical staff. Morphine had run out on July 8th. Wounded soldiers endured amputations and debridement with only alcohol as anesthesia. A Canadian medic who captured one of these aid stations later wrote, "They were children, most 15 to 18 years old. Missing legs, missing arms, faces burned, and still they asked when they could return to their units. I didn't understand if this was courage or insanity. It was neither. It was the product of indoctrination so complete that these boys could not conceive of any identity beyond soldier, any purpose beyond fighting. Wounds that would have sent other men gratefully to the rear left them desperate to return to combat. The bombing's failure to break German resistance created tactical problems for Montgomery that would persist through the remainder of the Normandy campaign. 76% of northern Caen was destroyed, creating rubble fields that blocked Allied advances as effectively as intact German defenses. Roads became impassable. Armor could not navigate the ruins. Infantry was reduced to scrambling over debris, silhouetted against the skyline, perfect targets for concealed German defenders. The Allies had transformed Caen from a difficult military objective into an impossible one, and they had done it to themselves. The ruins would remain a tactical obstacle even after the last German withdrew. French civilian casualties from the bombing exceeded 3,000 dead, with perhaps 10,000 injured. This exceeded German military casualties in the Caen sector by an order of magnitude. The arithmetic was obscene. To kill perhaps 200 German soldiers and force a limited withdrawal, the Allies had killed 15 times that many French civilians. Norman residents, who had welcomed Allied forces in early June, now viewed them with bitter resentment. "The Germans occupied us," one survivor told a Canadian journalist, "but you destroyed us." This tension between liberation's promise and its reality would persist long after the war ended. Caen was free but uninhabitable, its population homeless, its infrastructure ruined, its dead uncounted because bodies remained buried in collapsed buildings. Meyer's diary entry for July 10th revealed his state of mind. After 3 days of apocalyptic combat, we held northern Caen for a month. Today we abandoned it. Not because we were defeated, we withdrew in good order, but because holding longer meant death for no purpose. Berlin calls this defeatism. From Berlin, everything looks different. The entry captured the division's situation perfectly. Tactically, the 12th SS remained capable of fighting. Operationally, they were doomed by attrition they could not replace. Strategically, they were commanded by leaders in Germany who had no understanding of the battlefield situation and refused to authorize retreats that might salvage surviving forces for future defense. The boys would fight until they died because old men in Berlin demanded it. The aftermath of Operation Charnwood left both sides frustrated. The British had finally taken northern Caen after a month of trying, but southern Caen remained in German hands, and the victory cost over 3,000 casualties for minimal territorial gain. The 12th SS had conducted a successful fighting withdrawal, preserving their combat corps, but they had lost another 2,000 men they could not replace and been forced from positions they had held since June 7th. No one won Operation Charnwood. Both sides simply lost differently. grinding each other down in a battle that proved armies of industrial nation-states could be destroyed faster than either side could achieve decisive victory. The battle for Caen would continue for 2 more weeks. It would claim another 10,000 Allied casualties and reduce the 12th SS to a shadow of its original strength. And it would accomplish almost nothing except converting a medieval city into dust. July 15, 1944. An overworked clerk in the Wehrmacht personnel office in Berlin opens another casualty report from France and stares at the numbers with mounting disbelief. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, just 6 weeks in combat, reports 5,043 casualties, 1,700 killed, 2,600 wounded, 743 missing. The clerk checks the division's authorized strength, 20,500 men, and does the arithmetic, 25% casualties. He assumes this must be an error, perhaps a missing decimal point. He files a query requesting verification. 3 days later, the answer comes back. The numbers are correct. In fact, they are conservative. The actual casualty rate is closer to 30%. The Wehrmacht's newest elite division is being ground to pieces in Normandy at a rate that, if sustained, will destroy it completely within another month. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal and inescapable. An infantry division requires approximately 85 to 90% strength to function effectively. Below that threshold, units lack the manpower to execute complex operations, hold assigned sectors, or maintain rotation that prevents exhaustion. The 12th SS, by mid-July, hovered at 70% strength and falling. Replacement soldiers were arriving, younger boys pulled from training depots, many with only 6 weeks preparation rather than the 9 months the original division received. These replacements died faster than veterans because they lacked combat experience. The division was bleeding out, transfused with inferior blood that could not restore its fighting capability. Tank losses told an even grimmer story. The 12th SS entered Normandy with 150 Panzer IVs and 39 Panthers, 189 tanks total. By July 15th, 63 were total losses, burned out hulks on Norman battlefields. Another 41 were damaged, awaiting repair in field workshops that lacked spare parts and operated under constant air attack. That left 85 operational tanks, 45% of original strength. Worse, the Panthers, the division's killing edge, were being lost faster than Panzer IVs because their mechanical complexity made them harder to maintain and recover after damage. Each lost Panther was irreplaceable. Germany's industrial capacity in July 1944 could not build tanks faster than Allied forces destroyed them. The replacement crisis revealed the fundamental unsustainability of creating elite divisions from narrow age cohorts. The original 12th SS drew from boys born in 1926 who had completed 4 years of Hitler Youth service. This created remarkable uniformity, but allowed no reserve pool. When those boys died, the Wehrmacht had to dip into younger age groups, boys born in 1927, then 1928, ultimately pulling 16-year-olds directly from training to fill holes in the division. These children lacked even the basic competence of the original cohort. They were ideologically committed but tactically incompetent, likely to die. Within days of joining their units, ammunition expenditure patterns revealed the tactical cost of fanaticism. Wehrmacht doctrine prescribed ammunition allocations based on expected consumption rates for defensive operations. The 12th SS was exceeding those rates by 40%, firing more rounds per engagement than comparable divisions. This reflected their aggressive tactics, Meyer's emphasis on counterattacks rather than pure defense, the boys' tendency to fire at any target rather than conserving ammunition for confirmed threats. The result was that the division was running out of ammunition faster than logistics could resupply it. By late July, some units were rationing machine gun ammunition, something unthinkable earlier in the campaign. Fanaticism was literally outrunning supply. The casualty composition offered insights into how the division fought and why its losses were so severe. 68% of casualties were infantry panzer grenadiers who bore the brunt of close combat in the hedgerows and Caen ruins. Tank crews suffered lower casualties in absolute terms, but higher percentages. 31% of Panzer Regiment personnel were killed or wounded, compared to 25% of infantry. This reflected the vulnerability of German armor to Allied air power and the 5-to-1 numerical advantage Canadian tank units enjoyed. A Panther might kill 5 Shermans, but the 6th Sherman got through. The mathematics always favored the side that could afford to lose more. Medical statistics revealed the war's industrial brutality. Shell fragments caused 72% of wounds. Artillery and mortar fire, not bullets, were the real killers. 21% of wounded died before reaching aid stations because evacuation under air attack was often impossible. Of those who reached medical care, 82% survived, a remarkable figure given the primitive conditions in field hospitals. But survival often meant permanent disability. A 17-year-old who lost his leg to an artillery shell in July would spend the rest of his life as a disabled veteran. His adolescence ended by trauma that would shape every year that followed. Comparative analysis with other German divisions in Normandy showed the 12th SS fighting at unsustainable intensity. Panzer Lehr Division, an elite Wehrmacht formation, suffered 23% casualties over the same period high, but 2 percentage points lower than the 12th SS. The 716th Static Division, holding coastal positions, lost 18%. The pattern was clear. The more fanatically a unit fought, the faster it died. The 12th SS's aggressive tactics and refusal to yield ground were killing them faster than they were killing the enemy. In any rational military calculus, this should have prompted doctrinal changes. But rationality had little place in the 12th SS command culture. The economic cost of losing the division extended far beyond the soldiers themselves. Each Panther tank cost approximately 117,000 Reichsmarks to produce roughly 67 times an average German worker's annual salary. By mid-July, the division had lost Panthers representing approximately 5 million Reichsmarks, or roughly $3 million in contemporary currency. The human cost was incalculable. Each dead 17-year-old represented a worker who would never contribute to the economy, a father who would never raise children, a consumer who would never purchase goods. Germany was burning its future to defend its past, and the arithmetic made clear how this would end. Intelligence assessments from Allied side painted the 12th SS as simultaneously formidable and brittle. British Second Army intelligence reports from mid-July noted, "Enemy continues to fight with fanaticism, inflicting casualties disproportionate to his strength. However, unit cohesion shows signs of stress. Desertion rates increasing, particularly among recent replacements, recommend continued pressure to force collapse." The assessment was accurate. The division remained dangerous, but was approaching a breaking point. Every week of combat brought that point closer. The question was whether the Allies could destroy the 12th SS before sustaining unacceptable casualties themselves. Canadian casualties fighting the 12th SS exceeded their losses against any other German division. From June 7th through July 15th, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade lost 3,784 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Roughly 60% of these casualties came in engagements with the 12th SS rather than other German units. The kill ratio slightly favored the Germans. The 12th SS inflicted 3.7 casualties for every one they suffered, but this was strategically meaningless because the Allies could replace their losses, and the Germans could not. Time was on Canada's side. Arithmetic was on Canada's side. All they had to do was continue the killing until the division bled out. The psychological toll on survivors matched the physical casualty rate. Battalion medical officers reported epidemic levels of combat fatigue soldiers unable to sleep, unable to eat, staring blankly at nothing during rest periods. A post-war study of 12th SS veterans found that 78% exhibited symptoms consistent with what we now call PTSD. Many would struggle with these symptoms for the rest of their lives, traumatized by experiences they could not process and could not forget. The Nazis had created these boys as weapons, used them until they broke, then discarded them when they were no longer useful. The human cost of this cynicism extended decades beyond the war's end. Supply calculations revealed the impossibility of sustaining current operations. The division consumed approximately 100 tons of ammunition per day during active combat, plus 60 tons of fuel, 20 tons of food, and 5 tons of miscellaneous supplies. Allied air interdiction made delivering even half these quantities nearly impossible. Convoys traveled only at night, on secondary roads, and still suffered 30% losses to fighter bombers. By late July, the division was operating on roughly 60% of required supply levels. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel, artillery batteries rationed shells, wounded soldiers went hungry because food was diverted to combat troops. The Wehrmacht was losing Normandy not through lack of courage, but through mathematics no amount of fanaticism could overcome. The final statistic was the most damning: recruitment pool depletion. Germany had mobilized boys born in 1926 and 1927 almost entirely. The 1928 cohort was being called up early. Beyond that lay only children, boys too young, even by the Nazis' increasingly desperate standards. The 12th SS could not be rebuilt again after the next destruction because there were no more Hitler Youth graduates to draw from. This division, created to demonstrate the superiority of Nazi indoctrination, would instead demonstrate its limits. You could create fanatics from teenagers, but you could not create enough of them fast enough to win an industrial war against enemies who outnumbered you and outproduced you. The numbers did not lie. They never do. And they said the 12th SS was doomed. August 12th, 1944, 1800 hours. Kurt Meyer stands before a map at his division headquarters and traces the encirclement with his finger, his face betraying no emotion as he describes the tactical situation to his regimental commanders. Canadian forces are pushing south from Caen. American forces are hooking north from Normandy. The two arms of the Allied pincer are 40 kilometers apart and closing. Between them, squeezed into an ever-shrinking pocket, sit 100,000 German soldiers from two armies, including what remains of the 12th SS. Meyer has been ordered to hold the southern shoulder of the pocket, preventing the Americans from linking up with the Canadians, buying time for other units to escape. It is a death sentence disguised as a military order. Meyer knows this. His officers know this. The boys who will die executing this order know this. No one objects. They are SS. Obedience is everything, even obedience to orders that guarantee destruction. The Falaise Pocket was the result of brilliant Allied operational planning and catastrophic German strategic incompetence. After breaking out of Normandy in early August, American forces should have been pursued by German armies conducting fighting withdrawals to prevent encirclement. Instead, Hitler ordered a counterattack toward the coast, an offensive without adequate fuel, air cover, or artillery support. The counterattack failed within 48 hours, and its failure left German armies exposed in a salient the Allies could easily encircle. By August 10th, the trap was forming. By August 12th, it was closing. Any competent military leadership would have ordered immediate evacuation. Hitler ordered the pocket held. The 12th SS entered the pocket with approximately 5,000 effectives, 1/4 its June strength, and 40 operational tanks. They positioned along the Dives River near the villages of Trun and Chambois, where American and Canadian forces were trying to link up and seal the pocket. Meyer's mission was to keep the corridor open for German forces, escaping eastward while simultaneously preventing Allied link-up. This required attacking and defending simultaneously, offensive operations while in a collapsing defensive pocket. It was tactically sophisticated and operationally insane, the kind of mission that appears brilliant on a map and disintegrates into chaos on the ground. August 15th. The killing ground forms. Allied artillery observers on high ground surrounding the pocket can see nearly everything moving below. They direct fire with devastating accuracy. Convoys attempting to escape are annihilated. Columns of vehicles burn for kilometers. The roads become impassable with wreckage, forcing German troops to abandon vehicles and escape on foot. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Mustangs circle above like hawks, diving whenever they spot movement. They strafe anything that moves: trucks, tanks, horses, men. The 12th SS, attempting to maintain defensive positions while this apocalypse unfolds around them, loses cohesion rapidly. Companies become separated. Battalions cannot communicate. The division begins to disintegrate not through combat defeat but through sheer chaos. August 17th, the day the Allies will remember as Typhoon Tuesday. The weather clears after 3 days of overcast skies that had grounded most air support. Within hours, hundreds of Allied aircraft fill the sky above the pocket. They fly racetracks, attack, pull up, circle, attack again on predetermined lanes that prevent collisions. The attacks are methodical and annihilating. A Canadian pilot later describes it. You couldn't miss. The roads were packed with vehicles. You'd fire a burst, see a truck explode, and move to the next target. It was shooting fish in a barrel, and I vomited when I landed because I'd just killed hundreds of men who couldn't shoot back. The 12th SS loses half its remaining armor that day, 20 tanks destroyed, not by enemy tanks, but by rockets from aircraft they cannot engage. An 18-year-old Panther commander named Hans Schmidt experiences Typhoon Tuesday from inside his tank. He is navigating through a field of burning vehicles, trying to find a route that does not require driving over corpses, when a rocket slams into the Panther's engine deck. The tank does not explode but catches fire. Schmidt orders his crew to bail out. They do directly into the sights of Canadian infantry who have infiltrated to within 200 meters. Schmidt's gunner is shot before he clears the turret. His driver makes it 10 meters before Canadian machine gun fire cuts him down. Schmidt raises his hands in surrender. The Canadians, seeing his SS runes, hesitate. For a moment, Schmidt thinks they will execute him, revenge for the prisoners his division murdered in June. Instead, they take him prisoner. He will survive the war. Most of his company will not. August 18th through 20th, the pocket collapses. American and Canadian forces link up, sealing the gap. German soldiers inside the pocket face a choice: surrender or attempt breakout. The 12th SS attempts breakout. Meyer organizes his remaining forces, perhaps 2,000 men, 10 tanks, into a column that will attempt to fight through Canadian positions at night. The plan is desperate: move under cover of darkness, ram through weak spots in the encirclement, and run for German lines 30 kilometers east. It requires speed, surprise, and luck. They have none of these things. The breakout begins August 21st at 0200 hours. The Panther tanks lead, their frontal armor impervious to most Canadian weapons. Behind them, Panzer Grenadiers ride in half-tracks and trucks, and hundreds more follow on foot. They advance in near-total darkness, navigating by compass, hoping to find gaps in the Canadian lines. Instead, they find prepared defensive positions, Canadian troops alerted to the breakout attempt, artillery batteries pre-registered on likely escape routes. The lead Panther hits a mine, blocking the road. Following vehicles jam up behind it. Canadian artillery opens fire, catching the column in the open. The breakout becomes a massacre. Meyer's command group gets through by pure chance. They navigate cross-country, avoiding roads entirely, and stumble through a gap between two Canadian companies. Behind them, the rest of the column is being destroyed. Some groups fight through by overwhelming weak positions with suicidal charges. Others surrender when continued resistance becomes pointless. Many are simply killed, shot down as they ran. By dawn on August 21st, the breakout is over. Scattered groups of survivors straggle into German lines over the next 2 days. Meyer conducts a roll call on August 23rd. 300 men answer. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, authorized strength 20,000, now consists of 300 soldiers and 10 tanks. It has been effectively destroyed for the second time in 10 weeks. The Falaise Pocket's aftermath revealed the scale of disaster. Canadian burial parties counted 10,000 German dead in an area smaller than 20 square kilometers. They found corpses everywhere, in ditches, in burned vehicles, in fields where men had been caught by artillery fire while running. Many bodies were unidentifiable, burned or dismembered by explosions. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, complete artillery batteries abandoned when their horses were killed. The 12th SS left most of its heavy weapons in the pocket. Soldiers escaped with their personal weapons and little else. The boys who survived carried psychological scars that would never heal. They had spent 10 days watching comrades die in ways that defied comprehension, incinerated by napalm, torn apart by artillery, machine-gunned from aircraft they could not see until rockets were already inbound. They had eaten nothing but scraps, drunk from polluted streams, slept in ditches while explosions shook the earth around them. They had seen things teenage brains are not equipped to process. A post-war study found that 89% of Falaise survivors exhibited severe PTSD symptoms decades later, most never fully recovered. The Nazis had created these boys as weapons, but weapons break when overstressed. That is what happened in the Falaise Pocket. The human weapons snapped under pressure that exceeded their tolerances. Meyer's performance during the pocket was remarkable in its way. He maintained command and control far longer than should have been possible, organized a breakout that saved hundreds of lives, and escaped capture despite being personally targeted by Canadian forces who wanted him for war crimes. But his effectiveness could not change the strategic outcome. The pocket was a disaster because Hitler ordered it held rather than evacuating while escape was possible. No amount of tactical competence at division level could compensate for strategic stupidity at the highest command levels. Meyer and his boys paid the price for decisions made by men who never came within 200 kilometers of the battlefield. French civilians, returning to their villages after the battle, found a landscape transformed into hell. The roads were impassable, with wreckage. Fields were cratered. Every building showed damage from fire or shells. The stench of decomposing corpses, human and animal, was overwhelming. It took weeks to bury the dead, months to clear the wreckage, years to fully repair the damage. The Falaise Pocket was a tactical victory for the Allies, a strategic disaster for Germany, and an absolute catastrophe for the French people whose land became a slaughterhouse. Everyone lost something in that pocket. The boys of the 12th SS lost nearly everything. The division's destruction in the Falaise Pocket should have been final. Any rational military would have disbanded the remnants, distributed survivors to other units, and written off the division as a total loss. But the Nazis were not rational. The 12th SS was ideologically precious, a symbol of Nazi youth's fighting spirit. Orders came from Berlin within days. The division would be reconstituted again and return to combat. The 300 survivors, many wounded, all traumatized, would form the core around which a new division would be built. They would be given replacements, younger boys, less training, and sent back to war. The machine that created child soldiers was not satisfied with destroying them once. It would do so again and again, until there were no more children left to feed into it. September 17th, 1944. Nienburg Training Depot, Lower Saxony, Germany. 387 survivors of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend stand in formation while Heinrich Himmler inspects them with visible satisfaction. These boys, some on crutches, some with bandaged stumps where limbs used to be, all thin and hollow-eyed from Normandy, represent the nucleus around which an entire Panzer division will supposedly be rebuilt. Himmler speaks to them of glory, of sacrifice, of how their courage in France proved the superiority of National Socialist fighting spirit. The boys stare straight ahead, faces expressionless. They have heard speeches before. In Normandy, speeches did not stop artillery shells or fighter-bomber rockets. Himmler promises the division will return to combat, stronger than ever. The boys know better. They have seen what happens to divisions that die and resurrect. The second version is never as good as the first. The reconstitution faced problems that no amount of Nazi rhetoric could solve. The original 12th SS had been created from a specific cohort, boys born in 1926, who had completed 4 years of Hitler Youth service. That pool was now depleted, its survivors scattered across hospitals and graves from Normandy to Germany. The new division would be assembled from whoever was available, boys as young as 16 with minimal training, recovered wounded who should have been medically discharged, even some conscripted Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel who had never served in ground combat. This was not a recreation of the original division, but a hastily assembled replacement that merely wore the same uniform. Equipment shortages revealed Germany's collapsing industrial capacity. The original division had received 150 Panzer IVs and 39 Panthers. The reconstituted version received 30 Panzer IVs and 37 Panthers, 67 tanks total, 1/3 the original strength. No artillery was available to replace the batteries lost at Falaise. Self-propelled guns, half-tracks, armored cars, all in drastically reduced numbers. The division that had been one of the most powerfully equipped in the Wehrmacht in June was now below standard strength in every category. But Hitler demanded it be returned to combat because its name and insignia had propaganda value that transcended military reality. The veteran NCOs faced impossible challenges, training replacements who should not have been sent to combat units at all. A sergeant who survived Normandy later recalled training sessions in October. Boys who could barely handle a rifle, some so young they cried when we yelled at them. We were supposed to turn them into SS Panzer Grenadiers in 6 weeks. It was criminal. We knew most would die within days of seeing combat, but orders were orders. The training emphasized weapons handling and basic tactics, but could not replicate the unit cohesion that comes from shared experience. The new soldiers would go into battle alongside strangers, not the close-knit groups that made the original division effective. Ideological indoctrination also differed from the original cohort. The boys arriving in September and October 1944 had grown up with the same Nazi education system, but were shaped by Germany's deteriorating situation. The original division believed absolutely in inevitable German victory. The replacements had watched the Wehrmacht retreat from Russia, had seen their cities bombed, had heard adults whisper doubts about final victory. They were less fanatical, more cynical, and more likely to question orders, traits that made them worse soldiers from a Nazi perspective but more rational human beings from any other viewpoint. The veterans noticed the difference immediately. These replacements lacked the suicidal enthusiasm that characterized the original division, October 1944. The reconstituted division conducts field training in the German countryside, and the inadequacy of preparation becomes obvious. Replacements cannot coordinate with tanks because they have never worked with armor before. Tank crews cannot operate effectively because their vehicles lack spare parts and ammunition for realistic training. Battalion-level exercises collapse into confusion because officers are commanding units they barely know, and soldiers are following leaders they have never met. A training observer from 1st SS Panzer Corps files a report stating bluntly, "This division is not combat ready and will not be ready for months. Recommend continued training." The recommendation is ignored. Germany cannot afford months. The war is being lost in weeks. Kurt Meyer returned to command in November after recovering from wounds sustained at Falaise. What he found appalled him. The division bearing his former unit's designation was a shadow wearing a corps's uniform. His diary entry from November 15th captured his assessment. They call this the 12th SS, but it is not. The real 12th SS died in Normandy. This is something else. A collection of boys and invalids, and whatever else the Reich can scrape together. Berlin expects miracles. We will give them only corpses. Meyer attempted to accelerate training, drilling his new soldiers relentlessly, but 6 weeks cannot compensate for 9 months of preparation. The veterans knew. The replacements sensed. This division was being set up for slaughter. The psychological profile of survivors created additional problems. Veterans of Normandy were not simply experienced, they were traumatized. Medical officers documented epidemic levels of what they called nervous exhaustion, inability to sleep, hypervigilance, violent reactions to unexpected noises, nightmares that woke entire barracks. These men needed months of rest and psychiatric care. Instead, they were designated as cadre to lead the new division into combat. This meant that psychologically damaged soldiers would command inexperienced boys in situations guaranteed to be traumatic. The Wehrmacht was creating a recipe for catastrophic breakdown under stress. Equipment quality reflected Germany's resource crisis. The Panthers delivered to the reconstituted division were from late production runs, characterized by declining quality control. Engines failed more frequently. Transmissions broke under stress. Armor plates showed cracks from rushed manufacturing. Fuel allocations assumed the division would capture enemy supplies, the same fantasy that doomed the original Ardennes offensive. Ammunition. Loads were calculated to sustain 72 hours of combat, with no realistic plan for resupply. Everything about the division's logistics assumed a short, victorious battle. No one was planning for the grinding defeat that reality promised. December 1st. Movement orders arrive. The reconstituted 12th SS will deploy to the Ardennes forest for a major offensive operation. Details are provided only to senior commanders, who learn that Hitler plans to break through American lines, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies. The plan requires everything to go perfectly: surprise, good weather, rapid advance, capture of enemy fuel dumps. Meyer reads the operations order and understands immediately that it is fantasy. The division cannot reach its objectives with the fuel allocated. It cannot sustain combat with the ammunition provided. It cannot achieve surprise when moving an entire panzer corps into assembly areas. But Hitler has ordered it. Questioned, not even when they guarantee failure. The replacements sensed they were heading toward disaster, even if they could not articulate why. Letters home from this period, preserved in archives, reveal their anxiety. "Mother, I am afraid," wrote a 16-year-old recruit from Munich. "The veterans do not speak about France, but I see their faces. I think many of us will not return." Another, age 17, wrote to his younger brother, "Do not volunteer for military service. Wait to be conscripted, and then do only what you must. This war is lost." The censors should have suppressed these letters. They violated regulations against defeatism, but by December 1944, even censors were too overwhelmed to enforce the rules strictly. The division departed for the Ardennes in early December, traveling by train to assembly areas in the German Eifel region. The journey took days because Allied bombing had destroyed so much rail infrastructure that detours were necessary. During one stop, an American fighter bomber strafed the train, killing 12 soldiers before they could reach combat. It was a preview of what was coming. The 12th SS was entering a battle where Allied air superiority would be total, where every daylight movement drew attack, where tactical skill mattered less than logistical reality. The boys did not know this. The veterans did. The difference between knowing and not knowing was visible in their faces. Final preparations in the Ardennes assembly areas consisted mainly of waiting in freezing weather for orders to attack. The offensive was scheduled for December 11th, then delayed to December 14th, then December 16th. Each delay increased the likelihood of discovery. But Allied intelligence missed the buildup, almost entirely distracted by their own offensive operations, and convinced Germany lacked the capability for a major counteroffensive. The Germans achieved strategic surprise despite numerous indicators. It would be the last time in the war they managed this. And it would not matter because surprise without adequate resources is merely delayed failure. December 15th, evening briefing. Meyer addresses his regimental commanders and explains the division's mission with brutal honesty. They will attack at H-hour plus 6 hours, after other divisions have breached American lines. They will advance to the Meuse River, 75 kilometers distant, within 72 hours. They have fuel for approximately 40 kilometers. When asked how they will cover the remaining distance, Meyer simply says, "We will capture enemy fuel dumps." When asked what happens if they cannot capture those dumps, he says nothing. There is nothing to say. The plan requires miracles. The division possesses only courage and weapons. In industrial warfare, those are necessary but not sufficient. The attack will fail. The only question is how many boys will die learning this lesson. The reconstituted 12th SS was simultaneously a propaganda construct and a military liability. It wore the uniform of an elite division, but lacked the training, equipment, experience, and cohesion that made a division elite. It was commanded by traumatized veterans, leading traumatized replacements into a battle planned by delusional leaders, pursuing a fantasy of victory when reality promised only defeat. Everything about this reconstitution was doomed not by bad luck or enemy action, but by the fundamental impossibility of creating effective military forces from children, wounded men, and scraps, then expecting them to achieve objectives that would have challenged forces at full strength. The original 12th SS died in Normandy. What marched into the Ardennes in December was a zombie wearing its skin, animated not by life but by Nazi ideology's refusal to accept death. December 12th, 1944. Führer headquarters, somewhere in Germany. Adolf Hitler stands before a wall-sized map of Belgium and traces with his finger the route his armies will take to the sea. Through the Ardennes forest, across the Meuse River, onto Antwerp, he envisions panzer divisions slicing through American lines, encircling entire Allied armies, recreating the great victory of 1940 when Germany conquered France in 6 weeks. His generals stand silently, knowing the plan is impossible but unable to say so. The fuel allocations cannot support the advance Hitler demands. The supply lines cannot sustain the offensive. The Americans are not the French of 1940, but Hitler tolerates no contradiction, so the generals nod and prepare to execute a plan they know will fail. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, rebuilt after its destruction at Falaise, will participate in this final gamble-doomed teenagers, commanded by a leader whose connection to reality has dissolved entirely. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, represented Hitler's attempt to replicate past success with forces that bore no resemblance to Germany's 1940 army. Then, the Wehrmacht was a superbly trained, fully equipped force fighting enemies who were unprepared and demoralized. Now, Germany fielded divisions that were shadows of their former selves, attacking an enemy that had learned how to fight, that enjoyed total air superiority, that possessed industrial capacity Germany could not match. But Hitler refused to fight a defensive war in the West, refused to conserve forces for a last stand defending Germany itself. He gambled everything on one last offensive that required everything to go perfectly when nothing had gone perfectly for Germany since 1942. The operational concept was sophisticated and completely detached from logistical reality. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, would attack on a 60-kilometer front through the Ardennes, the forested region where Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany meet. The terrain was considered tank-proof by Allied planners, lightly defended because they believed Germany could not mount a serious offensive through such difficult ground. Hitler was counting on this assumption. The attack would break through weak American defenses, race to the Meuse bridges, cross the river, and drive to Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies, encircling 4 Allied divisions, and forcing a negotiated peace in the West. The 12th SS would be part of 1st SS Panzer Corps, assigned the northern axis of advance, with mission to reach the Meuse within 48 hours. Fuel calculations revealed the plan's fundamental flaw. The 12th SS needed approximately 600,000 liters of fuel to reach the Meuse, conduct combat operations, and establish defensive positions. They were allocated 150,000 liters, enough to drive perhaps 30 kilometers before tanks ran dry. The plan assumed they would capture American fuel dumps during the advance. This assumption required knowing where those dumps were intelligence they did not have, and capturing them before Americans destroyed the stores, which defenders had been trained to do. The plan's success required the Americans to behave stupidly and the Germans to experience perfect luck. Neither condition was likely. The force composition reflected Germany's desperation. Of the 6 panzer divisions committed to the offensive, only 2, 1st and 12th SS Panzer, were at even 70% of authorized strength. The others were weaker, some barely deserving the designation Panzer Division. Infantry divisions included many units composed of rear area personnel, men over 40, recovered wounded, even some former Luftwaffe ground crews who had received minimal infantry training. This was not the Wehrmacht of 1940 or even 1943. This was Germany's last reserve, and it was woefully inadequate for the mission Hitler assigned. December 16th, 05:30 hours. German artillery opens fire across the entire Ardennes front, 2,000 guns firing in unison, attempting to replicate the devastating barrages that preceded German offensives earlier in the war. The bombardment lasts 45 minutes shorter than planned because ammunition shortages limited allocations. Then the infantry attacks, moving through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, overrunning American positions held by green divisions that had been sent to this quiet sector to gain experience. The initial breakthrough succeeds beyond German expectations. By evening on December 16th, some units have advanced 8 kilometers, captured over 1,000 American prisoners, and opened gaps in the American lines. For a moment, Hitler's gamble looks promising. The 12th SS waits in reserve, engines idling, consuming precious fuel just to keep from freezing in the brutal Ardennes winter. Their attack orders specify H-hour plus 12 hours they will exploit the breakthrough once infantry opens corridors through American defenses. But the breakthrough does not develop as planned. American forces, though surprised, do not collapse. They fight for every village, every crossroads, every bridge. The roads through the Ardennes, narrow, winding, prone to traffic jams, become clogged with German vehicles. The 12th SS sits for 15 hours before receiving movement orders, burning fuel and idle because the roads ahead are blocked by other divisions' vehicles. When they finally advance, they have already consumed fuel they will need later, December 17th. The 12th SS reaches the front and receives attack orders. Break through American defenses at Elsenborn Ridge, the high ground dominating the northern shoulder of the offensive. This mission contradicts the original plan. They were supposed to exploit a breakthrough, not create one against prepared defenses. But 1st SS Panzer Division, scheduled to make the breakthrough, has been, quote, delayed by traffic jams and determined American resistance. The 12th SS must attack immediately to maintain the offensive's momentum. Meyer realizes this means assaulting fortified positions, exactly the kind of battle his reconstituted division is least prepared to fight. But orders are orders. The attack will begin at dawn. American forces defending Elsenborn Ridge belonged to the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, units that had taken heavy casualties in recent fighting but maintained unit cohesion and occupied excellent defensive terrain. They had been warned by intercepted radio traffic that SS units were approaching. They had heard about Malmedy, where Kampfgruppe Piper from 1st SS Panzer Division had murdered 84 American prisoners the previous day. The defenders knew what they faced, and they prepared accordingly. Anti-tank guns positioned to cover approaches. Artillery pre-registered on likely attack routes. Infantry dug into frozen ground, shivering, but determined. The Americans were not going to break this time. The contrast between the two sides' capabilities was stark. American artillery could fire 10 shells for every one German shell, supported by ammunition reserves that were essentially unlimited. American forces had hot food, winter clothing, and regular rest rotations. They had air support waiting for weather to clear. The 12th SS had what they carried on their backs, fuel for perhaps 12 more hours of operations, and the fading hope that fanaticism could compensate for material inferiority. Meyer understood the arithmetic. His soldiers did not, but they would learn it soon enough. Tomorrow, December 18th, the attack would begin. Tomorrow, the reconstituted division would discover whether courage matters when you are outnumbered, outgunned, and operating with logistics that make success impossible. Hitler, in his headquarters far from the front, studied situation maps that showed German spearheads advancing, American defenses crumbling, victory within reach. His intelligence briefings omitted details that contradicted this narrative. The traffic jams, the fuel shortages, the stubborn American resistance, the weather forecast predicting clear skies that would allow Allied air forces to massacre German columns. Hitler saw what he wanted to see, a breakthrough that would change the war's trajectory. His generals knew better but dared not contradict him, so the offensive continued, consuming Germany's last reserves in an operation that had already failed even though the fighting had barely begun. The 12th SS would pay the price for Hitler's delusion, again. December 17th, 1944, 1300 hours. At a crossroads near the Belgian village of Bocage, 120 American soldiers of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, stand in a snow-covered field with their hands raised. They have just been captured by Kampfgruppe Piper, a battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS's sister unit in 1st SS Panzer Corps. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, commanding the battle group, is racing toward the Meuse River on a tight schedule that allows no delays. His orders are to advance rapidly, bypassing resistance, reaching the river before the Americans can destroy the bridges. Prisoners slow in advance. Piper gives an order, never definitively proven but strongly suspected, and within 15 minutes, 84 American soldiers lie dead in the snow, murdered while defenseless. The massacre will transform the Battle of the Bulge from a conventional military operation into something darker, where the rules of war apply intermittently and survival depends on which soldiers you encounter. The Malmedy massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of SS war crimes that stretched from the Eastern Front through Normandy to the Ardennes. Kampfgruppe Piper and the 12th SS were different units, but they shared organizational culture, training, and ideological indoctrination. Both were Waffen SS divisions. Both recruited heavily from Hitler Youth. Both were taught that ruthlessness demonstrated commitment, that mercy was weakness, that enemies of National Socialism deserved no consideration under the laws of war. When Piper's men machine-gunned American prisoners, they were acting from the same psychological framework that led 12th SS soldiers to murder Canadian prisoners in Normandy. The organization created killers, then expressed shock when those killers killed. The mechanics of the massacre were brutally simple. After the Americans surrendered, they were herded into a field and searched for weapons and valuables. Guards positioned 2 machine guns to cover the prisoners. Then accounts differ on exactly what triggered the shooting. Someone opened fire. Within seconds, both machine guns were firing into the mass of prisoners. Some Americans dropped immediately, killed or pretending to be dead. Others ran and were hunted down. A few escaped into nearby woods, hiding until the SS moved on, then making their way to American lines to report what had happened. Their testimony, confirmed by the bodies discovered days later when American forces recaptured the area, provided irrefutable evidence of a war crime. Unlike many SS atrocities, this one would have witnesses who survived to testify. News of Malmedy spread through American forces with devastating speed. By the evening of December 17th, units across the Ardennes front knew that the SS was murdering prisoners. The story grew in the telling. Some accounts claimed hundreds killed, described torture and mutilation that had not occurred. But the core truth was undeniable. SS troops had massacred defenseless American soldiers. The American response was predictable and unofficial. Orders went out that SS prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. In practice, many American soldiers simply stopped taking SS prisoners. Wounded Germans wearing SS uniforms were shot rather than evacuated. Groups attempting to surrender were machine-gunned. Officers who objected found their orders ignored. Malmedy created a cycle of atrocity that would persist through the remainder of the campaign. The 12th SS, though not directly involved in the Malmedy massacre, benefited from the chaos it created. Piper's rampage down the northern shoulder of the offensive drew American reserves and attention, diverting forces that might otherwise have reinforced Elsenborn Ridge, where the 12th SS was attacking. But the massacre also transformed how American soldiers fought SS units. Before Malmedy, Americans treated SS soldiers as elite but legitimate military opponents. After Malmedy, they treated them as war criminals who deserved no quarter. This meant that 12th SS soldiers attempting to surrender, even those who had committed no atrocities themselves, were often killed rather than captured. The massacre committed by a different SS unit created consequences the 12th SS would bear throughout the campaign, December 18th. Word reaches the 12th SS through multiple channels, radio intercepts, captured American soldiers, reports from other German units that something happened at Malmedy, that American forces are furious about prisoners being killed. Some soldiers understand immediately what this means for them. A veteran NCO tells his squad, "Do not expect the Americans to accept surrender now. They will shoot us like Piper's men shot them. Fight hard, because there is no other option." Others, particularly the teenage replacements, do not grasp the implications. They still believe surrendering is possible if battle becomes hopeless. They will learn otherwise, usually moments before they die. The massacre's impact on 12th SS casualties was significant and measurable. In Normandy, approximately 12% of division personnel became prisoners of war captured when wounded, isolated, or when positions became untenable. In the Ardennes, that figure dropped to less than 4%. The reduction was not because the 12th SS fought more effectively, but because American forces stopped accepting surrenders from SS troops. Statistical analysis of casualty reports shows dramatically increased kill-to-capture ratios after Malmedy. Where 1 in 8 SS casualties in Normandy were POWs, in the Ardennes it became 1 in 25. The difference represents approximately 400 soldiers who might have survived as prisoners, but instead died because Piper's men murdered 84 Americans. The organizational culture that enabled Malmedy was identical to that which produced the 12th SS prisoner murders in Normandy. Both resulted from SS training that systematically removed moral, restraints. From leadership that tolerated or encouraged war crimes, and from an ideology that dehumanized enemies. The specific perpetrators differed: Piper's men versus Meyer's men, but the enabling conditions were the same. After the war, when investigators documented SS war crimes, they found a consistent pattern: younger soldiers, ideological true believers, operating in units where commanders either ordered atrocities or created environments where such crimes went unpunished. The SS was not an organization that occasionally committed war crimes. It was an organization whose culture made war crimes likely wherever it operated. Piper himself would face trial for Malmedy after the war, convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, ultimately released after serving 11 years. The trials were controversial because they relied partly on confessions obtained through coercion, because some defendants were clearly following orders rather than acting on personal initiative, and because the Cold War made West German SS veterans useful potential allies. But the fundamental facts were never disputed. SS troops murdered American prisoners at Malmedy and at multiple other locations during the Ardennes offensive. The only questions were who specifically gave orders, how many defendants bore command responsibility, and what justice required when the perpetrators ranged from willing executioners to soldiers who participated reluctantly under orders. The psychological aftermath for American soldiers who witnessed or learned about Malmedy shaped the remainder of the war in Europe. They had entered combat believing, however naively, that warfare had rules, that soldiers could surrender honorably, that even enemies deserved basic humanity. Malmedy destroyed those assumptions. American veterans interviewed decades later described Malmedy as the moment they stopped seeing German soldiers as human beings and started seeing them as targets to be destroyed. One soldier said simply, "After Malmedy, killing Germans felt like exterminating vermin. We felt nothing." This dehumanization was precisely what SS indoctrination aimed to create in German soldiers. Malmedy's ultimate tragedy was that it transformed Americans into the kind of soldiers they were fighting against. The massacre overshadowed the 12th SS prisoner murders in historical memory, though the latter killed nearly twice as many victims. Malmedy became a symbol, the single most famous SS war crime in the West, while the Canadian murders remained largely known only to military historians and Canadian veterans. This disparity reflects the narratives different nations constructed about the war. Americans remembered Malmedy because it happened to American soldiers and crystallized American views about SS criminality. Canadians remembered Authie and Ardennes Abbey, but could not make those atrocities resonate beyond their national memory. Both sets of crimes emerged from identical organizational cultures. Both illustrated how SS indoctrination transformed teenagers into killers. Both demonstrated that war crimes are not aberrations, but predictable outcomes when armies deliberately remove moral constraints from young soldiers. December 19th. As the 12th SS attacks Elsenborn Ridge, individual soldiers begin experiencing the consequences of Malmedy, consequences they did not personally create but must nonetheless endure. Small groups attempting to surrender are machine-gunned. Wounded soldiers shot in their foxholes rather than captured. Prisoners taken during the initial assault disappear before reaching POW cages, killed by rear-area troops who have heard about Malmedy and want revenge. Meyer protests through official channels that his division's prisoners are being murdered, seeing no irony in his complaints given his division's record. American commanders respond that they are investigating, knowing full well that no investigations will actually occur. Both sides are now murdering prisoners, each justifying their actions by pointing to the other's crimes. This is what happens when the rules of war collapse. Everyone becomes complicit, everyone has justification, and the descent into barbarism becomes self-sustaining. The final assessment of Malmedy's impact on the 12th SS must acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. The massacre harmed them militarily while validating their ideology. It harmed them because American forces became far more determined to kill rather than capture SS troops, because it justified retaliation that increased 12th SS casualties, and because it ensured post-war justice would be pursued aggressively. But it validated their ideology because it confirmed the Nazi worldview that war was total, that enemies were merciless, that only fanatical resistance could prevent destruction. When teenage SS soldiers saw evidence that Americans were killing prisoners in response to Malmedy, it confirmed everything they had been taught about enemy brutality. They fought harder, surrendered less willingly, and justified their own war crimes as legitimate responses to American atrocities. Malmedy created a cycle of violence that persisted until the division's final destruction. Everyone was guilty. Everyone had justification. And hundreds of soldiers who might have survived died because organizational cultures on both sides prioritized revenge over mercy. December 17th, 1944, 1800 hours. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, Belgium, sit in a valley 2 kilometers west of the German border, unremarkable clusters of stone farmhouses that will become the 12th SS Hitlerjugend's killing ground. American forces, the 2nd Infantry Division, veterans of Normandy, and the 99th Infantry Division, Green troops, experiencing their first major battle, have established defensive positions throughout both villages after retreating from initial German attacks. They have transformed every building into a fortress, positioned anti-tank guns to cover approach routes, and registered artillery on predetermined target zones. Into this prepared defense, Kurt Meyer will hurl his reconstituted division in a battle that will destroy the 12th SS for the 3rd time in 6 months. The attack will demonstrate that fanaticism, however genuine, cannot overcome prepared defenses held by determined soldiers who outnumber you and possess superior firepower. But it will take 72 hours and 1,500 casualties for the lesson to be learned. The 12th SS approached Krinkelt-Rocherath exhausted before the battle began. They had spent 36 hours moving through the Ardennes in freezing weather, delayed repeatedly by traffic jams and American resistance. They had consumed fuel sitting in columns waiting for roads to clear. They had lost men to American artillery that targeted suspected assembly areas blindly but effectively. By the time they received attack orders on the evening of December 17th, the division was already degraded, tired, disorganized, operating with incomplete information about enemy positions. Meyer knew his soldiers needed rest and reconnaissance before attacking. He was given 4 hours and orders to attack immediately. This was the Wehrmacht in December 1944. No time for proper preparation, insufficient resources, and missions that assumed capabilities the force no longer possessed. December 18th, 0600 hours. The attack begins in darkness. Panzer Grenadiers, advancing through snow-covered forest toward Krinkelt. They move in company columns, attempting to infiltrate between American positions, but the defenders are alert and positioned in depth. American machine guns open fire at ranges under 100 meters, catching German infantry in the open. The first wave takes heavy casualties within minutes. Officers order the second wave forward, before the first has even reached American positions. Classic SS tactics that emphasize aggression over preservation of force. More casualties. The teenage replacements, experiencing combat for the first time, discover that courage does not stop bullets, that advancing while being shot at requires overriding every survival instinct. Some keep moving, others freeze, unable to make their bodies advance toward the guns. Veterans curse the replacements as cowards, not understanding that what they are witnessing is not cowardice but the normal human response to overwhelming terror. American defenders in Krinkelt are shocked by their opponent's youth and determination. A rifleman later writes, "They kept coming even after we killed dozens of them. Boys, some 14 or 15 years old from what we could see, running at our positions and getting cut down. It was like fighting children who didn't understand they were supposed to fall back when taking casualties. But the Americans, whatever pity they feel, keep firing. Their survival depends on killing these attackers before they reach American lines. Individual sympathy is a luxury no one can afford." The killing continues through the morning, German bodies accumulating in the snow, American ammunition stocks depleting rapidly. By mid-morning, Meyer commits his Panthers 37 tanks representing the division's remaining armored striking power. They advance down frozen roads toward Rocherath, intending to break through where infantry has failed. American anti-tank guns and bazookas, positioned in buildings and behind stone walls, open fire at point-blank range. The first Panther explodes when a 90mm anti-tank gun hits its side armor at 300 meters. The second throws a track, trying to maneuver in the narrow village streets, and becomes a stationary target disabled by a bazooka team that fires 3 rockets into its engine deck. Within 30 minutes, 8 Panthers are burning, or immobilized. The remaining tanks withdraw under cover of smoke, having achieved nothing except demonstrating that armor cannot operate effectively in close terrain against prepared defenders with adequate anti-tank weapons. December 18th, afternoon. The battle devolves into house-to-house fighting, close-quarters combat that negates most tactical sophistication. German squads assault buildings held by American squads. Grenades explode in enclosed spaces, killing attackers and defenders indiscriminately. Soldiers fight with rifles, then pistols, then knives when ammunition runs out. In one farmhouse, a 17-year-old SS soldier and a 21-year-old American private kill each other simultaneously, the German with a grenade, the American with his rifle. Their bodies are found later, close enough to touch, locked together in death. This is warfare at its most primitive, stripped of technology and ideology, reduced to young men killing each other in cellars and living rooms. Because distant leaders made decisions that ensured this moment would occur. American artillery proves decisive. The 2nd Division's artillery battalions fire over 20,000 shells during December 18th, pulverizing suspected German assembly areas, interdicting approach routes, dropping shells danger close to American positions when defenders called for fire on their own locations rather than be overrun. The 12th SS has minimal artillery support. Most batteries lost their guns at Falaise and never received replacements. They attack with courage and automatic weapons against an enemy that can call down overwhelming firepower whenever threatened. The mathematics are imbalanced catastrophically. For every American killed, 3 Germans die, and the Germans cannot replace their casualties while Americans can. December 19th. Meyer orders a renewed assault using his last reserve's 2 companies that had been held back for exploitation after the breakthrough. The breakthrough has not occurred. These companies attack anyway, advancing through terrain littered with German dead from previous attempts, moving toward American positions that are better prepared than when the battle began. The attack fails within 2 hours. Survivors retreat to starting positions, having accomplished nothing except adding their casualties to the mounting total. Meyer's headquarters receives reports throughout the day. 1st Battalion reports 50% casualties. 2nd Battalion cannot attack because it lacks sufficient combat effectives. The Panzer Regiment has 18 operational tanks, half its strength at battle start. The division is being bled white, attacking prepared positions it lacks the strength to overrun. The American defenders, despite their success, are approaching their own breaking point. The 2nd Infantry Division has fought continuously since December 16th. The 99th Division, composed largely of replacement soldiers, has lost over 2,000 men in 72 hours. Some units are down to 30% strength, but American commanders can reinforce, rotating fresh companies into positions, bringing forward ammunition and supplies despite German artillery interdiction. The 12th SS has no such capability. Every casualty is irreplaceable. Every round of ammunition expended cannot be resupplied. The division is a wasting asset, diminishing with every hour regardless of tactical outcomes. December 20th, morning. Meyer receives orders to break off the attack. The 12th SS has failed to capture Krinkelt-Rocherath, failed to break through Elsenborn Ridge, failed to open routes for German armor racing toward the Meuse. The offensive's northern shoulder has held, largely because teenage soldiers and veteran tankers could not overcome prepared defenses held by determined enemies with superior firepower. The 12th SS withdraws to defensive positions, having lost approximately 1,500 men in 72 hours, nearly 10% of the reconstituted division's strength. They inflicted perhaps 2,000 American casualties, a respectable exchange ratio, but strategically meaningless because the Americans held the ground and the Germans did not achieve their objectives. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath was a German tactical failure and an American defensive victory. For the 12th SS, it was simply another step toward annihilation. The veterans of Normandy recognized what had just happened, even if the replacements did not. The division had attacked with determination, using tactics that worked in France, and failed completely. American soldiers in December 1944 were not the same as Canadians in June. They had learned from earlier defeats. They fought smarter, used their artillery more effectively, and refused to panic when attacked by SS troops. The mystique that made the 12th SS terrifying in Normandy had dissipated. American soldiers had seen SS troops die like anyone else, had killed enough of them that the runic collar tabs inspired more hatred than fear. The psychological advantage the division once possessed was gone, replaced by American determination to destroy SS units wherever encountered. The village battlefields, when finally secured, revealed the human cost in excruciating detail. American burial parties found German bodies everywhere in snow-covered fields where they fell during initial attacks, inside buildings where they died in close combat, scattered along approach routes where artillery caught them advancing. Many dead were absurdly young, boys with barely visible facial hair, wearing uniforms sizes too large. One American chaplain, conducting burial services, wrote, "I prayed over German dead today. Children, most of them. I do not know if God hears prayers for boys who volunteered for the SS, but I said them anyway. Someone must mourn them, even if only an enemy chaplain who knows their leaders fed them. Into our guns like wood into a furnace." The battle's lessons should have prompted German commanders to halt the offensive and transition to defense. The failure at Krinkelrocherath demonstrated that even SS divisions could not break through prepared American positions without overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. The 12th SS lacked both. Continuing the offensive meant continuing the casualties for diminishing returns, but Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal, insisting that renewed attacks would eventually break American resistance. So, the division remained in the line, attacking when ordered, defending when not attacking, dying steadily from combat and exposure, and the accumulated stress of fighting a hopeless battle. The boys of the 12th SS were being destroyed not by enemy action alone, but by their own leadership's inability to accept reality. Meyer's diary entry from December 20th captured his exhaustion and growing despair. 3 days attacking, Krinkel, 1,500 casualties, no gain. Was ordered to attack again tomorrow. Told Corps Commander the division lacks strength for further offensive operations. Was told we attack anyway. The boys are exhausted, freezing, dying. Berlin demands miracles. We deliver only corpses. It was the entry of a man watching something irreplaceable, being destroyed for nothing, unable to prevent it, required to order young soldiers into battles he knows they cannot win. Meyer was a war criminal who commanded a division that routinely murdered prisoners. But he was also a soldier who understood that what was happening in the Ardennes was criminal in a different way, the deliberate waste of young lives in service of strategic fantasies that existed only in Hitler's imagination. December 23, 1944, 0800 hours. Panther tank commander Heinz Wolf sits in his turret, watching the fuel gauge show empty and trying to comprehend how he is supposed to follow the attack order his company just received. The gauge has been falling steadily for 3 days, first 3/4 full, then half, then 1/4, now effectively 0. Perhaps enough remains for 10 kilometers of movement if he is careful, less if the terrain is difficult or if combat requires maneuvering. The attack order directs his company to advance 25 kilometers toward Dinant on the Meuse River. Wolf picks up the radio and reports his fuel situation to battalion. The response is terse. Advance until fuel exhausted. Crew will destroy vehicle and retreat on foot. Wolf shares this information with his crew boys, aged 17 to 19, who have been fighting in this Panther for 6 days. No one speaks. What is there to say? They will advance until the engine quits, then blow up their tank and walk back to German lines through terrain swarming with American forces. This is what happens when operational plans require miracles. The miracles do not occur, and soldiers pay for the delusions of distant planners. The fuel crisis that doomed the Ardennes offensive was predictable from the first planning sessions. German logistics officers calculated that reaching the Meuse required approximately 400,000 liters of fuel per panzer division. The Wehrmacht could allocate perhaps 150,000 per division, barely enough to reach the attack's starting positions, conduct initial operations, and advance a fraction of the required distance. The plan assumed German forces would capture American fuel dumps during the advance, seizing stocks to sustain their own operations. This assumption required multiple conditions: discovering where Americans stored fuel, capturing those dumps before defenders destroyed them, and finding fuel compatible with German vehicles. None of these conditions obtained. American quartermasters destroyed supply dumps as Germans approached. The few dumps Germans captured contained gasoline, formulated for American engines, usable in German vehicles but only after risky mixing procedures. The fuel the offensive required never materialized. December 23 brought a tactical nightmare that transformed the fuel crisis into catastrophe. The weather cleared. For a week, overcast skies and fog had grounded most Allied aircraft, giving German forces freedom of movement during daylight hours. On December 23rd, high pressure moved in, bringing crystalline blue skies and unlimited visibility. Within hours, hundreds of Allied fighters and fighter bombers filled the air over the Ardennes. American pilots flew what they called cab rank missions, orbiting over the battlefield, diving to attack whenever ground controllers spotted targets. The result was annihilation of German columns caught in the open. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks, anything moving drew attack. Anything stationary became a target if reconnaissance identified it as military equipment. The air attacks destroyed Germany's already inadequate logistics system. Fuel convoys attempting to reach frontline units were strafed on the roads, tankers exploding, fuel burning, drivers killed. The few convoys that reached their destinations arrived with perhaps half their original cargo, the rest lost to air attack or consumed in detours around destroyed vehicles. The 12th SS, already operating on minimal fuel stocks, received almost no resupply after December 23rd. Tanks that needed refueling sat immobile, easy targets for American artillery. Trucks carrying infantry ran dry and were abandoned. The division's mobility, essential for the kind of aggressive maneuver warfare Meyer practiced, evaporated as fuel tanks emptied. Across the Ardennes, German tankers faced identical situations. Orders to advance, empty fuel tanks, no resupply. Some units managed to move by draining fuel from disabled vehicles, consolidating what little remained to keep a few tanks operational. This worked briefly, but created a death spiral. Fewer operational vehicles meant reduced combat power, which meant less ability to capture objectives, which meant no access to captured supplies. Other units simply abandoned tanks where they sat, crews setting demolition charges to prevent capture, then walking back toward German lines. A Panther or Panzer IV represented months of industrial production, irreplaceable equipment that Germany's collapsing economy could not replace. They were being destroyed not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The human experience of the fuel crisis was grinding and demoralizing. Soldiers who had attacked aggressively for a week found themselves sitting in stationary vehicles, watching American aircraft circle overhead, unable to move, unable to fight effectively, reduced to targets. A Panzer Grenadier later recalled, "We sat in our half-track on a forest road, engine off to save fuel, freezing because we couldn't run the heater. American planes flew over, constantly. Every hour, someone would try to start the engine to see if we still had fuel. Nothing. We waited for orders that never came. Eventually, we just walked away, left the vehicle sitting there." This was not combat. It was entropy, the slow dissolution of an army that lacked the resources to function. Meyer attempted to maintain offensive operations by concentrating remaining fuel in a few units that could still move, creating ad hoc battle groups from companies that had operational vehicles. These groups would attack while immobilized units provided stationary fire support. The tactic worked briefly. Mobile groups could maneuver against American positions while static units pinned defenders. But it was stopgap, temporary, a way of delaying inevitable paralysis rather than solving the fundamental problem. By December 25th, even these improvisations failed. The 12th SS had essentially no fuel reserves. Units that had started the offensive with dozens of tanks were down to single digits of operational vehicles. The division's combat power was collapsing not because of casualties, though those were severe, but because its equipment lacked fuel. December 26th, orders arrived directing the 12th SS to withdraw from offensive positions and transition to defense. The offensive has failed. American forces have held Bastogne, a critical road junction that Germans needed to capture to sustain the advance. The weather has cleared, allowing Allied air power to massacre German columns. Fuel shortages have paralyzed German armor, and American reinforcements are arriving faster than Germans can advance. Hitler authorizes withdrawal to defensive positions closer to Germany, abandoning the offensive's objectives. For the 12th SS, this means retreating approximately 40 kilometers, a movement that, under normal circumstances, would take perhaps 4 hours. With fuel exhausted, it takes 3 days. Units that cannot move are abandoned. Wounded, who cannot walk, are left behind with medical personnel, who will become prisoners. Equipment is destroyed in place. The withdrawal is orderly but devastating, each kilometer revealing more evidence of defeat. The roads during withdrawal became nightmares. Abandoned German vehicles lined every route, trucks burned by air attack, tanks out of fuel, artillery pieces without tractors to tow them. German engineers destroyed bridges to slow American pursuit, but this also slowed German withdrawal, creating bottlenecks where retreating columns jammed together and became targets for artillery and airstrikes. The 12th SS, retreating on foot and in the handful of vehicles that still ran, took casualties during withdrawal that matched some combat actions. American pursuit was relentless. Fighter bombers strafed anything moving. Artillery hit suspected assembly areas. The retreat that should have been a maneuver became a gauntlet. Belgian civilians, emerging from cellars after weeks of battle, found their countryside transformed into a junkyard of destroyed military equipment. Panthers and Panzer IVs sat abandoned on roads, out of fuel, their crews gone. Half-tracks and trucks blocked intersections, burned or simply left when fuel ran out. Artillery pieces stood silent in fields, no longer able to move. The material cost of Germany's final offensive was staggering: hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, artillery batteries, all the mobile equipment an army needs to fight. Much of it was lost, not to enemy action, but to fuel starvation. An American logistics officer, surveying captured German equipment after the battle, estimated that 40% of German vehicles were abandoned due to fuel exhaustion rather than combat damage. The Ardennes offensive died not because American forces defeated it, but because it ran out of gas. The 12th SS reached defensive positions east of the German border on December 29th, having lost approximately 3,000 casualties in 2 weeks. Tank strength was reduced to 10 operational vehicles. Most infantry battalions were at 50% strength. The division that entered the Ardennes with 17,000 men and 67 tanks was now a hollow shell, capable of defensive operations in a static sector, but incapable of the kind of aggressive maneuver warfare that made it dangerous. The boys who survived were exhausted, frostbitten, traumatized by 2 weeks of continuous combat in Arctic conditions while slowly starving and freezing. They had fought courageously and achieved nothing except their own destruction. The Ardennes offensive was over. Germany's last strategic reserve was spent. All that remained was defending the Reich itself, and even that would soon prove impossible. Meyer's final assessment of the Ardennes campaign, written in January 1945, was brutally honest. We attacked with inadequate fuel, inadequate supplies, inadequate everything except courage. Courage is not enough when you cannot move, cannot resupply, cannot sustain operations beyond the initial assault. The offensive failed before it began because the plan required miracles, and miracles do not occur on demand. My boys died bravely in service of a fantasy. This is not strategy. It is murder disguised as military operations. The entry was dangerous. It could have resulted in Meyer's arrest for defeatism, but by January 1945, even the SS was beginning to admit realities that had been undeniable for months. Germany was losing. The war was lost. All that remained was determining how many more people would die before the inevitable end. January 15th, 1945. The remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend board trains at a depot in western Germany, destination unknown to most soldiers. They expect to be deployed to defend the Reich against Western Allied forces now pushing across Germany. Instead, the trains turn east. 3 days later, they arrive in Hungary, 1,000 kilometers from the Western Front, deployed not to defend Germany, but to protect Hungarian oil fields that Germany can no longer exploit. The decision to send the 12th SS east while Soviet forces approach Berlin is strategic insanity, made flesh evidence that Hitler's grip on reality has dissolved entirely. The boys, exhausted from the Ardennes, under-equipped, reduced to barely division strength, will be ordered to attack Soviet forces that outnumber them 10-1. This is no longer war. It is sacrifice of Germany's youth on the altar of Hitler's delusions, and the boys cannot even comprehend why they are being sent east when their homeland needs defending in the west. The strategic situation in Hungary reflected Hitler's bizarre priorities in the war's final months. Germany's last significant oil reserves were Hungarian fields at Nagy Kanica, which produced perhaps 30% of Germany's remaining petroleum. Soviet forces had reached Budapest in December, threatening to cut off these fields. Rather than husband remaining forces to defend Germany itself, Hitler ordered a counteroffensive in Hungary to recapture the oil fields and push the Red Army back across the Danube. The plan was delusional. Germany lacked the forces to conduct successful offensives anywhere, but Hitler insisted. The 6th SS Panzer Army, including the 12th SS, was pulled from the Western Front and sent to Hungary to execute an offensive that every professional soldier understood could not succeed. The 12th SS that arrived in Hungary bore little resemblance to the division that landed in Normandy. Strength was approximately 8,000 men, 40% of authorized levels. They had 25 operational tanks, mixture of Panthers and Panzer IVs, many in poor mechanical condition. Artillery support consisted of 2 battalions instead of 4, with limited ammunition. Transport was a disaster. Most trucks were destroyed. In the Ardennes, replaced by horses and wagons requisitioned from Hungarian farms. This was supposed to be an elite panzer division. It looked like a poorly equipped infantry division with a handful of tanks. The soldiers were a mix, maybe 1,200 survivors from the original Normandy deployment, traumatized veterans who should have been medically discharged, 3,000 men from the Ardennes who had minimal combat experience, and 3,000 fresh replacements, some as young as 16, pulled directly from training depots, February 1945. The division moves to assembly areas near Lake Balaton, the largest lake in Hungary, where German forces are massing for Operation Spring Awakening, Hitler's grandiose name for what would be Germany's last offensive of the war. The operational plan called for 3 German armies to attack simultaneously, break through Soviet defenses, recapture Budapest, and secure the Hungarian oil fields. The 12th SS was assigned to the offensive's southern wing, tasked with advancing 30 kilometers and capturing Soviet supply lines. The mission assumed the division possessed capabilities it no longer had. Meyer, reading the operations order, understood immediately that the offensive would fail and that his division would be destroyed, attempting it. He filed objections with 1st SS Panzer Corps, noting inadequate strength and supplies. The objections were dismissed as defeatism. March 6, 1945, 0430 hours. Operation Spring Awakening begins with artillery preparation that is pathetic compared to earlier German offensives. Perhaps 200 guns fire for 30 minutes, inadequate to suppress Soviet defenses across a 50-kilometer front. Then the infantry attacks, advancing through muddy fields where spring thaw has turned the ground to swamp. The Panthers and Panzer IVs, heavy even in good conditions, bog down immediately. Crews attempt to maneuver, engines screaming, tracks churning mud, going nowhere. Soviet defenders, anticipating the German attack through intelligence warnings and obvious German preparations, have positioned anti-tank guns and artillery to cover the approaches. They open fire as German forces advance. The 12th SS gains 3 kilometers the first day at cost of 400 casualties and 8 tanks. It is Normandy again, and the Ardennes again, courage confronting firepower, fanaticism meeting superior numbers, and young soldiers dying to gain ground that means nothing strategically. The Soviet forces defending against Spring Awakening were veterans of 3 years of brutal combat, men who had fought from Stalingrad to Budapest. They had learned how to kill German tanks, how to absorb attacks and counterattack, how to use artillery in concentrations that obliterated attacking forces. The 12th SS discovered this within hours of attacking. Soviet artillery fire exceeded anything they experienced in the West. Entire battalions, firing simultaneously, saturation bombardments that created killing zones where nothing survived. A German officer later testified, "The Russians used artillery like we use machine guns. Continuous fire. Waves of shells. They had ammunition without limit and used it to bury us." Combined with defensive positions that had been prepared for weeks, the Soviet defense was essentially impenetrable by forces at German strength levels. March 8th. The offensive continues despite clear evidence of failure. Hitler demands breakthrough, refuses to acknowledge that German forces lack capability to break through prepared defenses held by numerically superior enemy with adequate supplies and good defensive terrain. The 12th SS attacks daily, gains hundreds of meters, then is pushed back by Soviet counterattacks. Casualties mount 800 killed and wounded in 3 days, 10 more tanks destroyed. The division is disintegrating again, the survivors so exhausted that they can barely function. Medical officers report widespread frostbite spring in Hungary means temperatures above freezing during day, below freezing at night, and men alternately sweat and freeze. Trench foot becomes epidemic. Soldiers collapse from exhaustion and cannot be revived. March 15th. Soviet counteroffensive begins. 3rd Ukrainian Front, 1 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks and assault guns attacks the overextended German positions with overwhelming force. The 12th SS, holding a sector far too wide for its reduced strength, is immediately penetrated in multiple locations. Meyer orders fighting withdrawal, pulling back to successive defensive lines, attempting to preserve what remains of the division. Soviet pursuit is relentless. Tank columns punch through weak spots. Cavalry units flank German positions. Artillery fire is constant. The 12th SS retreats 30 kilometers in 48 hours, loses another 1,000 casualties, abandons all remaining heavy equipment. By March 17th, the division has ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Small groups make their way west toward Austria, hoping to reach American lines rather than be captured by Soviets. A 17-year-old soldier's letter home, never delivered, was found on his body after the war. "Mother, we are losing. The Russians are everywhere. I do not know if I will escape. If I die, know that I tried to do my duty. But I do not understand why we are here. Germany needs defending, but we fight in Hungary for oil we cannot transport. Nothing makes sense anymore. The officers say we must hold. But hold for what? We cannot win." The letter captured what many soldiers felt, but could not say aloud the growing recognition that they were fighting for a cause that was already lost, dying for objectives that meant nothing, sacrificed by leaders who had lost connection with reality. The boy who wrote that letter was killed 2 days later by Soviet artillery. He was 17 years, 3 months old. The retreat from Hungary became a nightmare of cold, hunger, and Soviet pursuit. The 12th SS marched west with almost no vehicles, carrying what they could, abandoning everything else. Wounded who could not walk were left behind with medical personnel, knowing they faced Soviet captivity and uncertain fate. Soviet forces, remembering German atrocities in Russia, showed little mercy to SS prisoners. Some surrendering SS soldiers were shot out of hand. Others were sent to camps in Siberia, where many would die of privation. The boys of the 12th SS, who had volunteered enthusiastically for the SS, now tried desperately to remove or conceal their SS insignia, hoping to pass as regular Wehrmacht and avoid Soviet retaliation. Heinrich Himmler's response to the Spring Awakening failure revealed the Nazi leadership's complete disconnection from reality. He issued orders stripping SS Panzer Divisions of their honorific cuff titles, the unit designations worn on the lower sleeve, because they had disgraced the SS by retreating. The order was ludicrous. The divisions retreated because they were outnumbered, undersupplied, and ordered to execute impossible missions. Himmler's response to failure was not to examine the strategic decisions that caused it, but to blame the soldiers for not achieving miracles. Few units bothered to comply with the order. By March 1945, even SS soldiers understood that Himmler's opinions mattered less than survival. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Only Hitler and his inner circle still pretended otherwise. The 12th SS survivors who reached Austria in late March numbered perhaps 2,000 men, 10% of the division's strength, at the start of Spring Awakening. They had no tanks, minimal artillery, inadequate small arms. They were a division in name only, a collection of exhausted survivors who could perhaps defend a static position if not pressed hard but could do nothing else. Meyer, gathering what remained of his command, understood that the division was finished. One more battle, and it would cease to exist. That battle was coming. The Red Army was pushing into Austria. The war would end soon. The only question was whether anyone would survive to see it. April 13th, 1945. 15-year-old Gunther Schultz stands in an SS uniform, 3 sizes too large, holding a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon he received 2 hours ago with instructions he barely understood. He is positioned in the ruins of an apartment building in Vienna's outskirts, ordered to destroy Soviet tanks when they appear. Gunther joined the Hitler Youth when he was 10, attended meetings and camps, learned to march and sing Nazi songs. He never imagined actually fighting. But in March, when Soviet forces approached Austria, the SS came to his Hitler Youth group and told every boy over 14 that they were being conscripted. Gunther protested that he was too young. The SS officer laughed and said, "Germany needs everyone who can hold a weapon." Now Gunther crouches in rubble, listening to artillery explosions growing closer, trying not to cry, wondering if his mother knows where he is. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend began with teenagers who volunteered enthusiastically for combat. It will end with children who were given no choice, sent to die defending a city that cannot be saved, in service of a regime that is already dead. The final deployment of the 12th SS violated every principle of military common sense. In April 1945, Germany was being invaded from east and west. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine. Any rational strategy would consolidate remaining forces to defend the capital or negotiate surrender to prevent further destruction. Instead, the 12th SS was ordered to defend Vienna, Austria's capital, strategically irrelevant, indefensible against the Soviet forces, approaching it. The order reflected Hitler's determination that every city be held to the last man, a policy that maximized casualties and accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. The division Meyer commanded in Vienna was a grotesque parody of the force that landed in Normandy. Strength was approximately 2,000 men, many wounded or recovering wounded who should have been hospitalized. There were no tanks. The last Panthers had been destroyed or abandoned in Hungary. Artillery consisted of a few towed guns with minimal ammunition. The majority of soldiers were either veterans so traumatized they barely functioned or emergency conscripts pulled from Hitler Youth groups in the final weeks of the war. These conscripts ranged from 14 to 16 years old, given perhaps 2 weeks training, issued whatever weapons remained in depots. They did not know how to coordinate with other units, how to conduct fighting withdrawals, how to survive in combat. They knew only that disobeying meant execution and that somehow they were supposed to stop the Soviet army. The Soviet forces attacking Vienna units of 3rd Ukrainian Front were veteran formations that had fought from Stalingrad to Austria. They outnumbered German defenders by perhaps 20 to 1 and possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery, armor, and air support. Soviet commanders, knowing the war was nearly over, were willing to use massive firepower to minimize their own casualties. They did not assault defended positions with infantry when artillery could pulverize them first. The result was a battle where German positions were systematically obliterated by bombardment, then overrun by Soviet troops who encountered minimal resistance. The 12th SS could not defend Vienna. They could only die there, which they did with pointless courage that changed nothing. April 6th through 13th. The battle for Vienna unfolded as a series of small unit actions that were individually insignificant but cumulatively devastating for the 12th SS. A company of Panzer Grenadiers would defend an apartment block until Soviet artillery reduced it to rubble, then survivors would retreat to the next block and repeat the process. Boys with Panzerfausts attempted to ambush Soviet tanks, sometimes succeeding in destroying a tank before being killed by accompanying infantry. Individual snipers inflicted casualties on advancing Soviets until they were located and eliminated by return fire. The defense achieved nothing strategically. Vienna fell exactly as Soviet planning anticipated, but it killed boys by the hundreds, most of whom understood they were dying for a lost cause, but fought anyway because disobedience meant execution by their own side. The emergency conscripts proved militarily useless, but symbolically significant. These boys, some barely pubescent, wearing uniforms that did not fit, carrying weapons they barely knew how to use, represented the final evolution of the 12th SS concept child soldiers taken to its logical conclusion. The original division recruited 17-year-olds who had been indoctrinated for years. The Vienna defenders included children pulled from schoolrooms days earlier. They were not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were sacrificial offerings, children fed into the furnace of a war already lost, dying to add perhaps hours to a defense that ultimately changed nothing. Their deaths demonstrated not the strength of Nazi ideology, but its moral bankruptcy. Kurt Meyer, commanding from a bunker complex beneath Vienna, faced an impossible situation. He had inadequate forces defending an indefensible city against an enemy that could not be stopped. Hitler's orders forbade retreat. Common sense dictated immediate surrender to save the lives of soldiers and civilians. Meyer chose an intermediate course. He would conduct a fighting defense that preserved his forces for eventual escape rather than suicidal last stands. Units were ordered to defend until positions became untenable, then withdraw to prepared fallback positions. This elastic defense bought time for civilians to evacuate and preserved more soldiers' lives than rigid defense would have. But it also meant continuing combat that served no military purpose, continuing casualties for objectives that did not matter. Meyer was still fighting, still trying to be a competent military commander, even though the war was unmistakably lost. April 13th. Soviet artillery bombardment of Vienna reaches its peak, 6,000 guns, firing for 4 hours, attempting to pulverize remaining German defenses before final assault. The bombardment creates a firestorm that consumes large sections of Vienna, killing thousands of civilians who did not evacuate. The 12th SS, positioned in cellars and underground shelters, survives the bombardment better than expected. Meyer had learned in Normandy that deep positions survive bombardments that obliterate surface defense. But survival only postpones death. When the bombardment lifts, Soviet infantry and tanks advance into Vienna's ruins and begin clearing remaining defenders building by building, cellar by cellar. The final defense becomes hide and seek with machine guns, German survivors ambushing Soviet columns from rubble, being hunted down, dying in small groups throughout the city. By evening on April 13th, Soviet forces control most of Vienna. The 12th SS holds only scattered strongpoints in the city's western suburbs, isolated groups that cannot coordinate with each other, waiting for orders that do not come. Meyer makes the decision that should have been made weeks earlier. He orders breakout. All units are to disengage after dark, move west toward American lines, avoiding Soviet forces. The order reaches some units but not others. Communications have broken down almost completely. Those who receive the order attempt to escape, those who do not continue fighting, until killed or captured. There is no organized final defense, no dramatic last stand. The 12th SS simply dissolves, individual soldiers and small groups trying to survive, the division ceasing to exist as a military organization. The breakout was chaotic and deadly. Small groups of German soldiers moved through Soviet-occupied Vienna at night, attempting to reach the western suburbs and then open countryside beyond. Soviet troops, alert to breakout attempts, had established checkpoints and patrols throughout the city. Most German soldiers attempting escape were captured or killed. A few hundred reached the countryside and continued west, hiding during day, moving at night, surviving on food looted from abandoned farms. They were not soldiers anymore. They were fugitives, trying to reach American lines before Soviet forces captured them, knowing that SS insignia meant probable execution if the Soviets caught them. Some succeeded, most did not. Gunther Schultz, the 15-year-old conscript, did not survive the Battle of Vienna. Soviet infantry found him in a cellar on April 14th, still clutching an empty Panzerfaust, too paralyzed with fear to surrender or fight. A Soviet soldier shot him without hesitation. He wore SS runes, which made him an enemy combatant regardless of age. Gunther's body was left in the cellar, undiscovered for weeks, ultimately buried by Austrian civilians in an unmarked grave with dozens of other unidentified dead. His mother never learned exactly when or how he died. After the war, she received official notification that he died in defense of Greater Germany. This was technically true, but deliberately misleading. Gunther died because the Nazis conscripted children in the war's final weeks, put them in uniform, and sent them to die for a cause that was already lost. His death accomplished nothing except adding one more name to the staggering casualty lists of a war that killed millions. May 1st, 1945, Hitler commits suicide in Berlin. Within days, German forces throughout Europe begin surrendering. The 12th SS, or what remains of it, ceases combat operations. Scattered groups of survivors surrender to American forces in Western Austria, relieved to be captured by the West rather than the Soviets. A few hundred soldiers remain unaccounted for, some captured by Soviets and sent to prison camps, others dead in unmarked graves, a handful successfully disappearing into Austrian civilian population. Meyer himself escapes the Vienna pocket and reaches American lines, where he is immediately arrested for war crimes. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend is officially disbanded. It existed for 23 months. In that time, it recruited approximately 38,000 soldiers. Approximately 18,000 died. Another 12,000 were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization. The survival rate was approximately 20%. For a division that was supposed to demonstrate the superiority of National Socialist ideology and Hitler Youth training, the statistics demonstrated only the capacity of that ideology to destroy children. December 10th, 1945. Canadian war crimes investigators stand in the garden of Ardennes Abbey, supervising the exhumation of bodies buried 7 months earlier. The monastery, damaged by artillery in the battle for Caen, shows evidence of hasty burials, disturbed earth, broken flagstones, areas where vegetation failed to grow. Shovels bite into Norman soil and uncover what investigators expected: bodies of Canadian soldiers, hands still bound with wire, bullet wounds to the skull, indicating execution rather than combat death. Each body is photographed, documented, identified when possible through identification tags and personal effects. By the end of the day, investigators have exhumed 23 bodies from the Abbey grounds. They will find more in wells near Authie, in a barn at Chateau d'Audrieu, in shallow graves across the 12th SS sector. The total will eventually reach 156 confirmed murders of Canadian prisoners of war. The evidence is overwhelming and irrefutable. The question is whether anyone will be held accountable. Kurt Meyer's trial, conducted by Canadian Military Tribunal in December 1945, became a test case for how justice would handle SS war crimes. The prosecution argued that Meyer bore command responsibility for murders committed by troops under his authority, that he created a command climate where atrocities were tolerated, and that he failed to punish subordinates who murdered prisoners. The evidence was substantial. Survivor testimony from Canadian soldiers who witnessed executions, French civilian testimony about murders at Ardennes Abbey, documents showing Meyer commanded the regiment and later the division during the period when murders occurred. The defense argued that Meyer never ordered executions, that murders were committed by subordinates acting without authorization, and that the fog of war made it impossible for a regimental commander to know everything his troops did. The trial lasted 2 weeks, heard from dozens of witnesses, and grappled with questions about command responsibility that had no easy answers. The verdict, announced December 28th, found Meyer guilty of war crimes based on command responsibility. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The sentence was controversial immediately. Some argued that executing a commander for crimes committed by subordinates set a dangerous precedent. It would make officers liable for every action by troops under their command, even actions they did not know about and did not authorize. Others argued that commanders who create cultures tolerating atrocities bear responsibility for resulting crimes. The debate reflected genuinely difficult questions about military justice. Meyer appealed the verdict. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in January 1946. Meyer would serve 9 years, released in 1954. He died in 1961, never expressing remorse for his division's war crimes. The difficulty of prosecuting 12th SS war crimes reflected multiple challenges. First, Identifying specific perpetrators proved nearly impossible. Survivor testimony could place crimes at specific times and locations, but rarely identified individual Germans. Many witnesses saw murders from a distance or in darkness or during chaotic situations where identifying faces was impossible. Second, German military records were deliberately destroyed or lost. The 12th SS burned most documents during retreats, eliminating evidence that might have identified perpetrators. Third, many potential defendants were dead, killed in combat before the war ended. Fourth, witnesses were scattered. Canadian survivors returned home. French civilians were reluctant to testify in trials held. Outside France, German soldiers denied everything. The result was that only a handful of 12th SS members ever faced trial despite evidence that hundreds participated in war crimes. Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the 26th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment and implicated in the Château d'Audray massacre, was never prosecuted. He was captured by Soviet forces, spent years in Soviet captivity, and returned to West Germany in 1955. Canadian prosecutors sought his extradition for war crimes trials, but West Germany refused, claiming insufficient evidence. Mohnke lived until 2001, dying at age 90, without ever facing charges for murders committed by troops under his command. His case illustrated a pattern. As the Cold War intensified, West Germany became less willing to cooperate with Allied war crimes prosecutions, particularly when defendants were potential anti-communist allies. Justice became subordinate to political calculations. The legal paradox of prosecuting child soldiers complicated every case. Many 12th SS perpetrators were 16 to 18 years old when they committed war crimes, minors under international law at the time. How should justice treat teenagers who murdered prisoners while serving in an organization that had indoctrinated them since age 10? The prosecutors argued that age did not excuse murder, that soldiers old enough to fight were old enough to know the laws of war, and that accepting age as a defense would give immunity to child soldiers regardless of their crimes. The defense argued that adolescent brains are not fully developed, that these boys were victims of indoctrination they could not resist, and that punishing teenagers for crimes committed under ideological manipulation was unjust. Neither position was entirely wrong, which made reaching just verdicts nearly impossible. The contrast with Malmedy trials was instructive. American prosecutors pursued SS soldiers accused of murdering American prisoners at Malmedy and other locations with considerable success, securing convictions against dozens of defendants. The trials were controversial, some confessions were obtained through coercion, and several convictions were overturned on appeal. But many convictions stood, and defendants served substantial prison terms. The Canadian prosecutions of 12th SS war crimes resulted in far fewer convictions despite comparable evidence. The difference reflected resources. American military justice had more investigators, more prosecutors, more political will and priorities. Americans viewed Malmedy as an attack on Americans that demanded response. The Canadian murders, while equally criminal, received less attention and fewer resources. Justice depended partly on which army you belonged to. October 1948. The final major trial of 12th SS war crimes concludes with acquittals for all defendants due to insufficient evidence. Canadian veterans, watching perpetrators walk free, are disgusted but not surprised. They understand that the window for justice is closing. Most potential witnesses have returned to civilian life and are reluctant to travel to Germany for trials. German witnesses claim not to remember or deny knowledge of crimes. Documentary evidence was destroyed during the war. The perpetrators have spent 3 years developing alibis and coordinating stories. Some have died of disease or injury sustained during the war. The remaining defendants present themselves as ordinary soldiers who followed orders, knew nothing of atrocities, and are being persecuted for losing a war. The tribunal, unable to prove individual guilt beyond reasonable doubt, acquits. Justice has been delayed until it became justice denied. The long-term impact on survivors, both victims and perpetrators, shaped lives for decades. Canadian veterans who witnessed the murders, or who learned about them and subsequently killed SS prisoners in retaliation, carried guilt and trauma that many never processed. They had violated the laws they fought to uphold, become killers themselves, and lived with the knowledge that they were not entirely different from the enemies they fought. German veterans who committed or witnessed war crimes faced different trauma. Some genuinely felt guilt, others rationalized their actions as legitimate combat. Many simply refused to discuss the topic. Post-war psychiatric studies found that participants in atrocities suffered higher rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide than veterans who did not participate. Murder damages the murderer as well as the victim, a psychological truth that complicated the already complex question of justice. By the 1980s, when the last investigations into 12th SS war crimes closed, only 12 members of the division had been convicted of war crimes. Given that evidence documented at least 156 murders, and that hundreds of soldiers likely participated or had knowledge of these crimes, the conviction rate was under 5%. Most perpetrators lived full lives in post-war Germany, integrated into civilian society, raised families, held jobs, and died of natural causes without ever acknowledging their crimes. This outcome troubled Canadian veterans who felt justice had failed, but it reflected realities of post-war prosecution, the difficulty of proving individual guilt decades after crimes occurred, political calculations that made pursuing aging Germans less important than maintaining Cold War alliances, and genuine questions about whether prosecuting child soldiers for indoctrinated behavior served justice or merely revenge. The moral questions raised by 12th SS war crimes remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Can child soldiers be held fully accountable for crimes committed under systematic indoctrination? Where does command responsibility begin and end? How should justice balance the perpetrator's age and psychological state against the severity of their crimes? What obligations do societies have to prosecute war crimes when doing so becomes politically inconvenient? The 12th SS case offered no clear answers. Meyer was convicted and imprisoned, then released and lived freely. Monke was implicated but never prosecuted. Hundreds of others escaped justice entirely. The victims remained dead. Their families received neither justice nor closure, and the world learned that accountability for war crimes depends less on evidence and moral clarity than on political will, resources, and timing. Justice delayed became justice denied, as it so often does when we allow expedience to override principle. June 6, 2024. A German Bundeswehr officer stands before a classroom of military academy cadets and begins a lecture on the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. On the screen behind him, statistics appear. 38,000 soldiers served in the division across its 23-month existence, approximately 18,000 killed, 12,000 wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization, 8,000 captured or missing. Survival rate approximately 20%. The officer lets those numbers sit silently for a moment, then asks his students, was this division effective, or was it a catastrophic waste of human life? The question is not rhetorical. It demands grappling with uncomfortable truth that the 12th SS was simultaneously one of the most effective fighting forces in the Wehrmacht and a moral abomination that destroyed children in service of a genocidal regime. Understanding both aspects is essential for military professionals who must learn from history without romanticizing evil. The tactical effectiveness of the 12th SS is documented extensively and undeniable. In Normandy, the division faced 8 different Allied divisions and inflicted disproportionate casualties on all of them. Statistical analysis shows the 12th SS achieved kill ratios of approximately 3-to-1, despite being usually outnumbered and operating with limited air support and artillery. In defensive operations south of Caen, the division held terrain for weeks against repeated Allied attacks supported by overwhelming firepower. At Krinkelt-Rocherath in the Ardennes, teenage soldiers stopped veteran American divisions cold. The tactical competence resulted from excellent training, superior equipment in some categories. Panthers outclassed Shermans significantly, and the kind of fanatical determination that made 12th SS soldiers willing to die rather than retreat. These factors combined to create combat effectiveness that Allied commanders grudgingly acknowledged, even while seeking to destroy the division. But tactical effectiveness must be weighed against strategic meaninglessness. The 12th SS never achieved any operationally significant objective. They did not prevent the Normandy invasion from succeeding. They did not hold Caen, the city fell despite their defense. They did not break through at crinkled Rocherath. They did not recapture Hungarian oil fields. Every battle they fought was either a defensive delaying action or a failed offensive. They traded casualties for time, buying days or weeks for Germany through sacrifice of soldiers who could not be replaced. In a war of attrition that Germany was losing, tactical success that failed to produce strategic advantage was merely expensive failure. The division killed Allied soldiers and delayed Allied advances, but ultimately changed nothing about the war's outcome. The human cost transcends simple casualty statistics. The 38,000 soldiers who served in the 12th SS were predominantly boys aged 16 to 18, recruited from Hitler Youth. They were not career soldiers making informed choices about military service. They were adolescents who had been indoctrinated since childhood, whose personalities were shaped by an organization that systematically eliminated critical thinking, who volunteered not from genuine understanding but from manufactured enthusiasm for a cause they could not evaluate objectively. The Nazi state created these soldiers by corrupting childhood itself, by transforming youth organizations into recruitment pipelines for wars that would kill the recruits. The crime was not just the murders the division committed, but the creation of the division in the first place. Modern military psychology treats the 12th SS as a case study in indoctrination, child soldiers, and command responsibility. The division demonstrates that ideological commitment can create tactically effective soldiers, but at costs that are ethically and strategically unacceptable. Child soldiers, however well trained, lack the judgment necessary for complex decision-making, the emotional regulation to handle extreme stress without breaking, and the moral development to resist committing atrocities when peer pressure or authority figures encourage such acts. The Wehrmacht created an effective tactical force but guaranteed that force would commit war crimes and suffer psychological casualties at rates that undermined its own effectiveness. The lesson for modern militaries is clear. Recruiting and indoctrinating children creates problems that no amount of tactical training can solve. The division's war crimes, 156 confirmed, murdered Canadian POWs. Unknown numbers of Soviet and civilian victims were not aberrations but predictable outcomes of the system that created the division. Boys raised from age 10 to see enemies as subhuman, to view ruthlessness as virtue, to seek approval through violence, will commit atrocities when given weapons and authority. The murders at Ardennes Abbey, Authie, Château d'Audrieu, and dozens of other locations emerged logically from Hitler Youth indoctrination. Officers who objected to crimes were mocked or transferred. Officers who tolerated crimes were promoted. The organization created killers systematically, then expressed surprise when those killers killed. This was not failure of the system, but the system functioning as designed. June 2024. Ardennes Abbey, now a memorial and museum. School children from Germany visit annually to learn about the division formed from boys their age. They stand before plaques listing names of Canadian soldiers murdered in these gardens, and their teachers explain what happened, how indoctrination works, how ordinary people commit atrocities, why examining uncomfortable history matters. Some students place flowers at the memorial. One, a 14-year-old girl, asks her teacher, "Could this happen again?" The teacher pauses, then answers honestly, "Yes. If we allow governments to militarize childhood, if we permit ideology to replace education, if we prioritize loyalty over critical thinking, yes, it can happen again." That is why we study this history, not to blame you for things you did not do, but to teach you to recognize warning signs when governments start treating children as weapons. The contrast with modern child soldier rehabilitation programs is instructive. Organizations working with former child soldiers in contemporary conflicts emphasize that these children are victims first, perpetrators second. Rehabilitation focuses on education, psychological treatment, and reintegration into civilian society. The underlying assumption is that children forced or indoctrinated into military service should not bear full responsibility for actions committed under those conditions. This approach would have been appropriate for 12th SS soldiers. Most were children when recruited. All were victims of systematic indoctrination. But post-war justice, constrained by the scale of crimes and limited resources, could only prosecute a handful, while the majority escaped accountability. Modern understanding suggests this was probably just not because the crimes were forgivable, but because prosecuting victims of indoctrination for crimes they committed as children raises more ethical problems than it solves. The statistical legacy is brutal in its clarity. Of 38,000 soldiers who served in the 12th SS, approximately 20% survived the war physically intact. Of survivors, post-war studies found over 75% exhibited symptoms consistent with PTSD. Depression rates among survivors exceeded 50%. Alcoholism, unemployment, broken marriages, suicide all occurred at rates dramatically higher than among Wehrmacht veterans from non-SS divisions. The boys who survived carried psychological wounds that never healed. Many refused to discuss their service. Others romanticized it, creating false memories where their division fought cleanly and honorably. A few acknowledged the reality. They had been used, corrupted, sent to kill and die for a cause that was evil, and they would carry the guilt and trauma until death. The 12th SS destroyed its soldiers whether they died in combat or survived to old age. The tactical lessons remain relevant for military professionals, while the ethical lessons remain critical for societies. Tactically, the division demonstrated that aggressive defense, proper use of terrain, and combined arms coordination can allow numerically inferior forces to inflict disproportionate casualties on attackers. These are legitimate military lessons studied in war colleges globally. Ethically, the division demonstrated that recruiting child soldiers, indoctrinating them ideologically, and employing them in combat creates forces that are tactically effective in the short term but strategically counterproductive, ethically indefensible, and psychologically devastating to the soldiers themselves. No tactical advantage justifies corrupting children and destroying their lives. This lesson matters for contemporary conflicts where child soldiers remain tragically common. The final reckoning requires holding two truths simultaneously. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was an effective fighting force that achieved impressive tactical results against superior enemies. It was also a criminal organization that murdered prisoners, was created through child abuse disguised as youth development, and destroyed tens of thousands of young lives in service of history's most evil regime. Both statements are factually accurate. Neither cancels the other. The division's tactical effectiveness does not redeem its crimes. Its crimes do not erase its effectiveness. Understanding this complexity is essential, because simplification treating the division as either pure evil or romanticized warriors obscures the real lessons history offers. Those lessons are uncomfortable, but necessary. First, indoctrination works. You can take children, subject them to systematic ideological programming, and create soldiers who fight courageously for causes they cannot evaluate objectively. Second, tactical effectiveness is not moral justification. The 12th SS killed many Allied soldiers but served a regime conducting genocide. Their effectiveness made them more dangerous and more criminal, not admirable. Third, child soldiers are victims even when they commit atrocities. The boys of the 12th SS made choices, but those choices were shaped by indoctrination they could not resist and psychology that was still developing. They bear responsibility, but so do the adults who created the system that corrupted them. Fourth, justice for historical crimes is always incomplete. Most perpetrators escape. Most victims never receive closure. Most societies would rather forget than prosecute. We should pursue justice anyway, while acknowledging its limitations. The cemetery at Ardennes Abbey contains graves of both Canadian soldiers murdered by the 12th SS and German soldiers from the division killed in the battle for Caen. They lie, within sight of each other, separated by nationality but united in being young men who died violently far from home. Canadian veterans visiting the cemetery in their final years sometimes stood between the gravesites and wept for their murdered comrades, but also for the German boys who killed them, recognizing belatedly that all were victims of old men who sent children to war. One veteran, age 92, said shortly before his death, "I hated them. I killed them when I could, but they were children, and we were children, and we were all used by leaders who should have known better. I forgive them. I hope they forgive us. I hope God forgives all of us." The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend existed for 23 months, recruited 38,000 soldiers, and achieved tactical effectiveness that impressed even its enemies. It also murdered prisoners, destroyed its own members psychologically and physically, and served a genocidal regime that represents the nadir of human evil. The division was effective and abominable, tactically competent and morally bankrupt, proof that you can create deadly soldiers from children, and proof that doing so is unconscionable regardless of military results. We study this history not to celebrate tactical effectiveness or wallow in atrocity, but to learn the lesson that child soldiers, however created, however employed, are crimes against humanity that destroy the children we claim to be protecting. The mathematics are clear. The 12th SS killed many enemies at the cost of destroying an entire generation of German youth. That is not effectiveness, that is tragedy. And the greatest tragedy is that nearly 80 years later, child soldiers still exist, still fight, still die, because we have not learned the lesson the 12th SS should have taught us. Children are not weapons, and any cause that treats them as such does not deserve to win.